Silas Crow slammed his fist on the counter of Harlan's trading post, hard enough to rattle the tin cups hanging from the ceiling hooks. "I want that debt called in," he said. "Today. Not tomorrow. Not next week. Today." Harlan Briggs looked up from his ledger, his pen still pressed to the page. He was a cautious man by nature, the kind who chose his words the way a man chooses his footing on ice. But even he couldn't keep the surprise off his face. "Silas, the woman's got nothing. You call in $60 on Etta Rowan, you're throwing her and those two kids into the road before the first snow hits." Silas straightened his coat lapel and smiled. "Then I suppose she should have thought about that before her dead husband mortgaged land he couldn't work." He tapped the counter with 2 fingers. "Call it in." The door to the trading post opened before Harlan could answer. Cold mountain air pushed through the gap, and with it came a man nobody in Frost Hollow had expected to see before spring. Thorne Mercer set a leather pouch on the counter without a word. The coins inside made a sound that everyone in the room recognized, the sound of more money than most of them would handle in a month. "How much does she owe?" Thorne said. If this is your first time finding this channel, welcome. Hit that subscribe button right now and turn on notifications so you never miss a story like this one. Every week we bring you tales of courage, grit, and real human spirit from the frontier, the kind of stories that stay with you long after the screen goes dark. If this story moves you, tap that like button and drop a comment telling us what city or country you're watching from. We love seeing how far these stories travel. Now let's find out what Thorne Mercer saw in Etta Rowan and why it changed everything. The morning Thorne Mercer rode back into Frost Hollow after 14 months in the high country, he looked exactly the way the mountains had made him, weathered, deliberate, and carrying the specific kind of quiet that comes from spending too much time alone with hard decisions. His horse was a thick-legged roan that moved without being pushed. The saddlebags were full. He hadn't planned to stop at the trading post at all. He'd meant to resupply and ride out by noon. But then he'd heard Silas Crow's voice through the plank walls before he even tied his horse, and something in the pitch of it, that particular blend of satisfaction and contempt, made him stop with his hand on the door handle. He stood outside long enough to understand what was happening. Then he went in. The trading post was small and low-ceilinged, stacked with bolts of fabric, dried goods, rope coils, and the particular smell of wood smoke and coal oil that clung to every building in town. 4 men were standing near the back wall, 2 of Silas's hired hands, a farmhand named Decker, who mostly kept his mouth shut, and old Harlan behind the counter looking like a man who wished he'd stayed in bed. Silas Crow stood at the center of it the way he always did, like the room had been arranged for him. He was 53 years old, broad across the chest, and had the kind of face that looked trustworthy until you spent enough time around it to notice that the smile never quite reached his eyes. He owned the largest dry goods operation in the county, 3 warehouses along the main road, and approximately half the debt in Frost Hollow. He was the kind of man who collected obligations the way other men collected tools, because you never knew when they'd come in useful. He turned when Thorne came through the door, and his expression shifted. Not much, just enough. Thorne noticed. "Mercer," Silas said. "Didn't expect to see you until June." Weather cooperated. Thorne set the pouch on the counter. "How much does she owe?" Silas laughed. It was a short, easy laugh, the kind you use when you want to seem generous but feel nothing of the sort. "You don't even know what you're stepping into." "I know enough." Harlan opened the ledger, ran his finger down a column, and said, in the careful tone of a man trying not to make anything worse, $62.40. That includes the October interest. Thorne opened the pouch and counted out the coins without hurry. He laid them on the counter in a row, which was a deliberate thing to do, the kind of thing that made the act impossible to look away from. Nobody spoke while he did it. Even the farmhand Decker seemed to hold his breath. When the last coin was down, Thorne said, "That covers it?" Harlan looked at Silas. Silas's jaw had tightened, but he was still wearing the smile. "It covers the debt," Silas said. "Doesn't change the fact that the land's in no shape to produce anything. Woman's been running it into the ground for 2 years." "That's not your concern anymore," Thorne said. There was a moment, just a moment, where something passed across Silas Crow's face that was harder than irritation and colder than anger. Then he put his hat on and buttoned the top button of his coat. "Your money," he said. "Your mistake." He nodded to his men and walked out. Harlan exhaled. He gathered the coins into the pouch and started writing in the ledger. "You want a receipt?" "I want her to get it," Thorne said. "Whatever's hers. I want her to have it in her hand." Harlan looked up at him over the top of his glasses. "You know the whole town's going to talk." "They'll talk either way," Thorne said. He picked up the empty saddlebag from the floor. "I'm going to need flour, dried beans, salt pork, and whatever you have in terms of nails. 12 penny, if you've got them." It wasn't until Thorne had gone through half his shopping list that Decker, the farmhand who'd been standing in the corner the whole time, finally said what he was thinking. "You planning to fix up her property?" "That's the idea. 60 acres of rock and bad drainage beside a mountain pass that's frozen 8 months a year." 7 months, Thorne said. "And the pass itself is the point." Decker stared at him for a moment, then shook his head the way a man does when he's watching someone do something he considers a spectacular waste of effort. He walked out without saying goodbye. Harlan waited until the door closed, then said quietly, "He's going to tell everybody." "I know," Thorne said. Etta Rowan was stacking fence posts at the edge of her property when she heard the horse coming up the trail. She didn't stop what she was doing. She'd learned in the 2 years since Martin died that stopping what you were doing every time someone came by was a good way to never get anything done, and getting things done was the only thing standing between her and a future she didn't want to think about. She was 41 years old and knew exactly how she looked to other people. She'd known for a long time. She'd spent her 30s trying to care less about it, and her 40s learning that caring less wasn't the same as not being aware of it. She was a large woman, heavy-boned, broad-shouldered, carrying weight in her hips and chest and belly that had been there since her second pregnancy and never left. She wore her dark hair pinned back because she didn't have time for anything else, and her dress was the same brown wool she'd been wearing since October because it was warm and she only owned 2. She heard the horse stop at her fence line and turned around, expecting one of Silas Crow's men with a notice. Instead, there was a man she recognized but had never spoken to, sitting on a roan horse and holding what appeared to be a piece of paper. "Mrs. Rowan," Thorne Mercer said. "Mr. Mercer." She set down the fence post and wiped her hands on her apron. "If you're here about the debt, I already know." "It's cleared." She looked at him. "What?" He swung down from the horse and walked to the fence, held the receipt out over the rail. "Paid this morning. Harlan wrote it up." She took the paper and read it twice. Her hands didn't shake, which she was privately grateful for, because her chest was doing something that would have made her voice unsteady if she'd tried to speak right then. She breathed through it and looked up. "Why?" she said. Thorne leaned against the fence post. "I want to talk to you about this land." "You didn't answer the question." "No," he said. "I didn't." She waited. This was another thing she'd learned, that silence made most people uncomfortable enough to fill it, and what they filled it with was usually more honest than whatever they'd planned to say. Thorne looked out at the 60 acres. It was rough land, she knew that. Rocky in the east quarter, soggy in the northwest corner, where the spring runoff collected, with an old barn that needed a new roof and a main house that needed everything else. Martin had bought it for almost nothing 5 years ago because the man who'd owned it before had given up. She sometimes wondered if Martin had bought it because he'd recognized something in land that other people had given up on. "The pass," Thorne said finally. "You're sitting at the mouth of the only reliable pass through the Callaway Range that's sheltered enough to use in early winter." She looked at him. "I know where I'm sitting. Travelers use it every fall. Miners, wagon trains running late in the season, ranchers pushing cattle to lower ground." He turned back to her. "Every one of them needs somewhere to stop, a meal, a bed, somewhere to stable a horse overnight and let a sick animal rest. Right now there's nothing. The nearest lodging is 18 miles south, and it's been full since August." Etta was quiet for a moment. She understood what he was describing. She'd actually thought about it herself, in the way you think about things you can't afford to think seriously about. You're talking about a way station, a lodging station, something bigger than a way station. We build it right, we could handle 30 travelers at a time, more in good weather. "We," she said. "I've got skills you don't have," he said. "Timberwork, stonework, trapping, and hunting to keep the operation supplied through winter. What I don't have is any ability to manage 20 workers, organize a supply chain, or run a building full of people who all need different things at the same time." Etta looked at him steadily. "And you think I can?" I've seen you keep this place running for 2 years after your husband died, with 2 kids, a broken plow, and a creditor who's been trying to run you off. He paused. Yeah, I think you can. She was quiet for a long moment. The wind came off the mountains and moved through the grass at the fence line, with a sound like something being decided. What's in it for you? She said. Equal split on whatever the operation earns. You keep the land. It stays in your name. I'm not asking for deed rights. If we dissolve the partnership, I walk away with whatever share we've agreed to in writing, and you keep everything built on your property. Etta folded the receipt carefully and put it in her apron pocket. I'd want a lawyer to draw the agreement. That's fair. And I'll want it in writing before we break a single piece of ground. Also fair. She looked at him again. There was something she'd been trying to work out since he handed her the receipt, something that didn't quite fit the shape of what she knew about men who paid off other people's debts. In her experience, that kind of gesture always had a shape to it, and the shape was usually property or obligation, or the particular power that comes from making someone feel like they owe you something they can never repay. But Thorne Mercer didn't look like a man waiting for gratitude. He looked like a man who'd done a calculation and arrived at a number he thought was right. Why not a young woman, she said. Someone who doesn't come with 2 kids and a reputation for being the town joke. The question surprised him. She could see that. Not offended, just surprised, the way people are when you say plainly a thing they've been thinking around the edges of. Because I spent 14 months in the mountains by myself, he said, and I came back needing a partner, not a wife. What I need is someone who doesn't quit when it gets hard. And from what I can see, you don't quit. Etta said nothing. The kids are a consideration, he said, but not the way you mean. They can help once things are running, and you'll want them close. That's practical. She almost smiled at that. Not quite, but almost. You're a strange man, Mr. Mercer. Most people think so, he said. Well, the town found out within 48 hours. Frost Hollow was the kind of place where news moved faster than weather, and news this specific, that Thorne Mercer had paid off Etta Rowan's debt and was planning to build some kind of lodge with her on that rocky wreck of a property up by the pass, was exactly the kind of thing that gave people something to do with their mouths. The reaction was mostly laughter, not the warm kind, the comfortable kind, the kind people use when they want to feel smart without having to think hard. Ed Phelps at the feed store said Thorne had been alone in the mountains too long and it had softened his brain. Margaret Delaney, who ran the boarding house on the main street, said she felt sorry for the man because clearly he hadn't gotten a good look at Etta before he made the deal. The 2 Kastner brothers, who did odd carpentry work around town, said they'd seen the property and the main house needed to be torn down and started over, and if Mercer thought he was going to get a working lodge out of 60 acres of rock and runoff before the first heavy snow, he must be drinking his own trapping supply. Silas Crow said nothing publicly, which was, in its own way, the loudest thing anyone said. Etta heard all of it. She heard it because she went into town to buy supplies the day after she and Thorne shook hands on the agreement, and nobody in Frost Hollow had ever really learned that she had good ears and a habit of keeping her face still when she was listening. She walked down the main street carrying her list, went into 3 different stores, bought what she needed, and didn't stop to respond to a single thing she heard. Not the whispers behind her, not the comment from Ed Phelps that was pitched just loud enough to be heard from the doorway. She carried the supplies back to her wagon, loaded them herself because she didn't need help, and drove home. Her daughter Clara was waiting on the porch. Clara was 12 years old and had her father's eyes and her mother's tendency to think before speaking, which was a combination Etta was grateful for. Her son, Robbie, was 8 and currently somewhere behind the barn doing something with a rope that Etta had decided not to investigate. I heard you made a deal, Clara said. Who told you? Mrs. Phelps. She didn't mean to, she was telling Mrs. Kastner, but she was doing it in front of the school. Etta sat down on the porch step and looked out at the land. The afternoon light was hitting the east quarter, and it looked, in that particular slant of late autumn light, almost pretty. Not actually pretty, but almost. What do you think? Clara said. About which part? About Mr. Mercer. About what people are saying. Etta was quiet for a moment. What are they saying? That he made a mistake. That you'll ruin him. Clara said it without flinching, which was one of the things Etta loved about her. That the land's no good, and the plan's no good, and by Christmas, He'll be sorry. And what do you think? Etta said. Clara considered. I think if Mr. Mercer is dumb enough to get fooled by Silas Crow's version of things, he wouldn't have lasted 14 months alone in the Callaway Range. She paused. And I don't think he's dumb. Etta looked at her daughter. No, she said. I don't think he is either. Thorne arrived at the property on a Tuesday with a mule loaded with hand tools, a roll of survey stakes, and a man named Walt Greer, who he introduced as the best stonemason in the county. Walt was 57, stocky, and had the specific kind of skeptical squint that comes from a lifetime of looking at structures other people had built wrong. He walked the property for 20 minutes without saying a word, stopping to press his boot into the ground in various places, crouching to look at the stone formations along the east ridgeline. Then he came back to where Thorne and Etta were standing and said, You've got good stone here. The east side's mostly granite, stable base. That's what I thought, Thorne said. The northwest corner's a problem. You can't build on that. We're not building on it, Etta said. We're digging drainage channels. Redirect the spring runoff to the south. The water goes downhill, it'll miss the foundation by 30 feet. Walt looked at her. Who figured that? I did, she said. 2 winters ago. I watched where the water went. He scratched his jaw. That could work? It'll work, she said. The first surveying took 3 days. Etta walked every foot of it with Thorne and Walt, and she kept a notebook in which she recorded everything: soil conditions, drainage patterns, prevailing wind direction, which areas got morning sun, and which were in shadow by midday. She asked questions that surprised both men, not because they were clever questions exactly, but because they were specific questions, the kind that showed she'd been thinking about the land as a working problem for a long time. Thorne watched her work and didn't say much. That was a quality she'd come to notice about him in those first few days. He was a man who observed before he commented, which was rarer than you'd expect. On the third evening, sitting around the fire that Walt had built near the old barn, Thorne spread the survey notes on a flat rock and started sketching the lodge layout. He was a fair draftsman, functional rather than artistic, and the plan that emerged was a long, low building with a central common room, 6 sleeping quarters on one side, and a kitchen and storage area on the other. Etta looked at it and said, Move the kitchen to here. She put her finger on the northwest end. If the kitchen is at the southeast corner, the smoke and heat goes into the sleeping rooms when the wind comes down from the pass, which it does most evenings. You'll have guests complaining and a fire risk. Thorne looked at the sketch. You're right. And the stable should be here, not here, closer to the road. Travelers with tired horses want to get the animals settled before they worry about themselves. If the stable's at the back, half your guests are going to be irritable before they walk through your door. Walt laughed, a short, genuine sound, the kind that comes out involuntarily. She's not wrong, he said to Thorne. No, Thorne agreed. He erased the lines and started again. What? The first workers arrived the following Monday. 8 men Thorne had hired from neighboring homesteads, plus 2 of the Kendall brothers from town who needed winter work badly enough to overlook what the Kastners were saying about the project. Etta fed them breakfast before they started, which she cooked herself over the outdoor fire because the kitchen in the main house had a crumbling chimney that would take 3 days to repair. She was up before 4 to start the cooking. She didn't announce this or make it a point of pride. She just got up and got it done, and when the men arrived at sunrise, they found biscuits, salt pork, and a pot of coffee that had been going long enough to actually taste like something. Ed Kendall, who was 24 and had never particularly thought about Etta Rowan one way or another, ate 3 biscuits before he'd been there 10 minutes. This is good, he said, with the slightly stunned expression of a man who'd expected worse. Thank you, Etta said, and handed him a bucket of nails. The first 2 weeks were brutal in a way that had nothing to do with physical difficulty, though there was plenty of that. They were brutal because of the constant accumulating sense that everything that could go wrong was going wrong in the specific sequence most likely to cost the most time. The drainage channels they dug in the northwest corner hit a rock shelf 6 feet down that nobody had expected, which meant rerouting the entire design. A load of lumber arrived from the mill short by 40 boards, and the mill owner, when Thorne rode down to address it, was apologetic in a way that felt rehearsed, and mentioned, almost in passing, that Silas Crow had placed a large order the same morning and the mill had prioritized by account size. Thorne came back and told Etta about it without editorial comment. She sat with it for a moment. He's doing it through accounts, she said. Not directly. He'll use his business relationships to make things harder for us without ever saying our names. That's my read, Thorne said. We need a different supplier. Someone who's not in debt to him. She thought for a moment. There's a mill in Carver's Bend, 30 miles east, more expensive, but they're independent. That'll cut into the budget. So we'll be in short lumber, she said. He nodded. I'll ride out tomorrow. What she didn't say, sitting there in the cold with the sound of hammers going from the construction site 30 yards away, was that she'd spent the previous night going over the numbers for the third time, and she knew exactly how thin the margin was. She'd mortgaged the land to Silas in the first place because Martin had borrowed against it to buy seed and equipment, and the harvest that was supposed to pay it back had been flooded out in its second year. She understood debt the way you understand something that has been living in the same house as you for a long time. All its habits, all the ways it moved through a room, all the ways it made other things harder without ever being the thing that broke them. She did not say any of that to Thorne. He had enough to carry. Instead, she said, while you're in Carver's Bend, see if there's a smithy willing to contract. We're going to need ironwork for the door hardware and the stable fittings, and I'd rather have it agreed in advance than scramble for it in December. Thorne looked at her for a moment, that observing look, the one she'd gotten used to, and then said, anything else? Yes, she said. Find out who supplies Harlan's trading post with salt pork. Harlan's got the best price in 3 counties, and he gets it from somewhere. He almost smiled. I'll ask. Well, by the 4th week, the foundation was laid in the east quarter, and the framing crew had the main structure's bones standing 12 feet high against the sky. It was the kind of moment in a construction project that changes the quality of the effort. When there's something vertical where there was nothing before, something you can look at from the road and recognize as a building becoming itself. Word got around, the way word always did. A few people from town rode out on the pretense of various errands and slowed their horses when they passed the property. Etta noticed them from across the site, but didn't stop working. She was carrying stone for Walt's crew, which was not strictly her job, but which she'd started doing on the 3rd day when the worker assigned to it had sliced his hand open on a tool and needed 3 days off. She'd picked up the work because it needed to be done, and she'd kept doing it because Walt's crew worked better with steady supply, and she was faster at it than she'd expected to be. She was carrying a stone that weighed close to 70 pounds, not running, just moving with the steady, unhurried pace of someone who has learned the difference between working hard and working recklessly. When she became aware that 2 men on horseback had stopped at the fence line and were watching her, she kept going, set the stone where Walt pointed, went back for another one. One of the horsemen said something to the other. She didn't hear the words, but she heard the laughter. Walt looked up from his work. His jaw tightened. He started to say something. Don't, Etta said quietly. He looked at her. They're not here, she said. We are. He was quiet for a moment, then went back to his mortar. The horsemen eventually rode on. That evening, when the crew had gone and Thorne was reviewing the day's progress, she mentioned it. Not with emotion, just as a fact she was reporting. Thorne listened without expression. Then he said, Does it bother you? Yes, she said, but not enough to stop. He nodded, and something in the way he nodded told her he understood what that cost, and that he wasn't going to say anything about it, which was the right instinct. Walt says the stonework on the chimney stack will take another week, he said, returning to the notes. I know, she said. I moved up the delivery on the roofing material. It's coming Thursday now, not the following Monday. We can't afford to have the roof waiting on the chimney. He looked up. How? I wrote to the supplier directly and offered to pay the freight myself if they could move the schedule. She pulled the notebook from her apron. It comes out cheaper than a week's delay on the whole crew. He stared at her for a moment. When did you send the letter? 6 days ago, she said, when I first looked at Walt's timeline. Thorne sat back and did something she hadn't seen him do before. He laughed. Not the polite kind, not the performative kind. An actual laugh. The kind that means the world surprised you pleasantly. What? She said. Nothing, he said. You're just better at this than I expected. You expected bad, or you expected mediocre? I expected competent, he said. This is something else. She looked at him and decided not to say thank you. Instead, she said, The cook stove needs to be ordered this week. If we wait until December, the price goes up 15%. He picked up his pen. Tell me what you need. The week after that, Silas Crow stopped by in person. He came alone, which Etta noted. He came in the early afternoon when most of the crew was at lunch, which she also noted. He rode up to where she was working at the material staging area and dismounted without being invited, the way a man does when he's spent enough of his life in other people's spaces that permission has stopped occurring to him as a necessary thing. Making progress, he said, looking at the framing. We are, she said. He walked a few steps, hands in his coat pockets, doing a performance of idle interest that didn't fool her for a moment. I heard you're getting your lumber from Carver's Bend now. Better price, she said, which was not entirely true but wasn't entirely false either. Long haul for a supply line, he said. Things go wrong with supply lines in winter. She looked at him. Is there something you need, Mr. Crow? He stopped and faced her with an expression she'd seen before, the friendly version of something that wasn't friendly. I want you to understand that I don't hold hard feelings, he said. Business is business. Mercer paid the debt. That's done. But I've been running commercial operations in this county for 20 years, and I've seen a lot of projects like this one. Have you? She said. Ambitious start, good intentions. He shrugged. Most of them don't make it through the first winter. Etta kept her face still. It was a skill she'd developed over years of people saying things to her face that they thought she should feel worse about. I appreciate your concern, she said, with exactly the tone that meant she didn't. He seemed to weigh saying something else, then decided against it. He mounted his horse, tipped his hat in a gesture that was the physical form of a condescension, and rode back to the road. Thorne had been 60 feet away the whole time, working on the framing with the Kendall brothers. He came over when Crow was gone. What did he say? Thorne asked. She told him, word for word. That was something she'd started doing, repeating conversations accurately rather than summarizing them, because details mattered. Thorne was quiet for a moment. He's not done, he said. No, she agreed. He's not. She didn't say what she was thinking, which was that she'd been watching Silas Crow operate in this town for 7 years, and she understood his pattern as well as she understood the drainage patterns on her own land. He never hit a thing directly. He worked around it, applied pressure where the structure was weak, waited for the collapse he expected, and positioned himself to benefit from it. The difference this time, she thought, was that he'd never gone up against someone who'd already spent 2 years learning to hold together something that most people had written off. She picked up her notebook and went back to work. The days shortened, the temperature dropped in increments that felt polite at first and then stopped being polite. The crew worked through the first 3 hard frosts in November, and by the time the roofing material arrived on Thursday as scheduled, they were racing the season in a way that made every morning feel like a negotiation with the weather. Etta managed the interior work herself, directing 2 carpenters on the sleeping room walls while tracking the materials budget in the notebook she carried everywhere. She had a system, and it was a system she'd invented rather than inherited, for tracking which supplies were on hand, which were on order, and which were going to create a problem in approximately 10 days if nobody addressed them today. She updated it every evening by lantern light after the children were in bed. Clara had started helping with meals, which freed Etta for the last few hours of construction work each day. Robbie fetched water and ran messages between work sites, taking his job with the extreme seriousness of an 8-year-old who understood that his contribution was real. On a Thursday evening in mid-November, after everyone had gone home, Etta walked through the main structure alone. The roof was on. The chimney stack was complete. The floor was rough but solid. She could see the shape of it clearly now. The long common room where travelers would eat, the sleeping quarters down the hall, the kitchen with its south-facing window that would catch the morning light. She stood in the middle of the common room in the half-dark, and she felt something that took her a moment to identify, because it had been absent for so long. It wasn't happiness exactly. It was a kind of recognition, the feeling of standing somewhere that was going to become what you'd imagined it could be. She was still standing there when she heard boots on the threshold. Thorne stopped in the doorway. He looked at her, then at the room, then back at her. We might actually pull this off, he said. Yes, she said. We might. He leaned against the door frame and looked up at the rafters. 6, maybe 7 weeks. 5, she said. He looked at her. If we hire 2 more men for the interior work, which I've already priced out, and I reorganize the materials staging to cut 2 days off the floor installation, we can open the guest rooms by the second week of December. She paused. The first heavy snow is usually the third week. If we open before it hits, the first wave of late-season travelers will establish the reputation. After that, the word spreads itself. He was quiet for a moment. You've been carrying this in your head. I've been carrying it in the notebook, she said. But yes. He nodded. And she could see in the way he was looking at the room now that he was revising something. Not the plan, but his understanding of what the plan could be. What it was actually going to become. Outside, the wind came off the Callaway Range and moved over the pass, the way it always did in November, cold and purposeful and indifferent to everything below it. Inside the half-finished lodge, the walls held. They were going to make it, Etta thought, not easily, not without more of what the last 6 weeks had already cost them. But they were going to make it. And somewhere on the road back to Frost Hollow, Silas Crow was thinking the same thought in reverse, which meant he was going to do something about it soon. She wasn't wrong about that. She was just wrong about how soon. She wasn't wrong about that. She was just wrong about how soon. The first sign came 3 days later, and it didn't come from Silas Crow directly. It came from a man named Pell, who worked as a day laborer around town and had been hired by Thorne in the second week of construction to help with the framing. Pell was a decent enough worker, quiet, showed up when he said he would, didn't complain about the cold. On a Friday morning, he came to Etta before the rest of the crew arrived and stood at the edge of the staging area with his hat in his hands and the specific expression of a man who is about to say something that costs him something. "Mrs. Rowan," he said, "I need to tell you something." She was loading nails into a bucket, and she kept doing it while she listened because stopping felt like it would make him more nervous. "Go ahead." "Silas Crow came by my place last night," he said. "He offered me work. Said he needs a man for his warehouse starting December 1st. Better pay than what you're giving." He paused. "He also said, and I'm telling you this because I think you should know, he said that any man working on this project wouldn't be welcome in his stores. Not blacklisted, he didn't use that word, but he made it clear." Etta set down the bucket. "He's threatening the crew." "Not threatening, just making it known." Pell turned his hat in his hands. "There are men here who buy their family's supplies from Crow's store because it's the closest. If he cuts them off—" "I understand," she said. "What are you going to do?" He was quiet for a moment. "I came to tell you, didn't I?" he said. "I'm here. I'm staying. But I thought you should know what's being said." She looked at him. I was a man in his mid-40s with a wife and 3 kids, and a face that showed he'd thought hard about this before coming to her. "Thank you," she said, and meant it. "Tell me if you hear anything else." He nodded and went to work. She found Thorne 40 minutes later at the back of the property, where he was evaluating the timber they'd cut from the east ridge line. She told him what Pell had said, word for word. Thorne listened without moving. Then he said, "How many men do you think he got to?" "I don't know, but we should find out before it becomes a work stoppage." She crossed her arms against the cold. "The Kendall brothers buy from Crow's store. So does Mackie, the man on the door hardware." "What do you want to do?" "I want to call a meeting," she said. "This morning, before work starts. Get everyone together and say plainly what's happening. Don't let it fester in the gap between what they know and what they think they know." Thorne looked at her. "You sure? It might accelerate things. Men who are uncertain might decide it's not worth the risk." "Men who are uncertain are already halfway gone," she said. "The ones we want to keep are the ones who'll stay when they know what they're up against." He thought about it. "All right." She called the meeting at 7 in the morning, before hammers, before coffee had fully done its work. 9 men assembled in the half-framed common room, their breath making small clouds in the cold air, their faces doing various things that told her they'd heard pieces of what she was about to say. She didn't stand on anything to make herself taller. She didn't change her voice to make it sound more official. She just spoke. "Silas Crow is applying pressure to the men on this crew," she said. "Some of you may have already heard from him directly. Some of you may have heard through other people. I'm not going to pretend it isn't happening, because you'd know I was pretending, and that would be a worse problem than the truth." She paused. "If any man here decides the risk to his family's supplies is too great, I understand. Leave now, no hard feelings, and you'll get paid for every day you've worked. But if you stay, I need you to stay knowing what it might cost. And I need to know that you're staying because you've made a real decision, not because you're waiting to see how things shake out." The room was quiet. Wind moved through the gaps in the framing and made a sound like something listening. Ed Kendall spoke first. He was 24 and Etta had always thought he had more sense than his age suggested. What's he actually going to do? Cut off credit or cut off sales entirely? I don't know, Etta said. I think he's hoping the uncertainty does the work for him. Typical, said Mackey, the door hardware man, who was 48 and had opinions about most things. Man never does dirty work where he can get someone else to do it for him. That may be, Etta said, but it's still a real risk and I won't minimize it. Pell, from the back, said, What about supplies for us? He tried to go after the lumber or anything coming in. He's already interfered with one delivery, Thorne said. It was the first time he'd spoken, and the room shifted slightly toward him in the way rooms do when a man who rarely speaks decides to. We rerouted around it. We'll do it again if we need to. How? Ed Kendall asked. We're building the only decent lodging between here and Carver's Bend, Thorne said. Every supplier east of the range wants access to what comes through this pass. When we're open and doing business, Crow is one account. We'll be 10. That landed in the room and settled. Mackey said, I'll buy my family's supplies from Harlan's trading post instead. Been meaning to anyway. Nobody left. Not one man picked up his coat and walked out. They went back to work when the meeting was done, and Etta had the distinct impression that something in the dynamic had shifted, that the meeting had made the crew into something slightly more than a collection of hired workers. Not a team, exactly. Not yet. But something moving in that direction. Thorne fell into step beside her afterward. That was well handled, he said. Don't thank me yet, she said. Now he knows we're not going to fold quietly. That changes what he'll do next. She was right, and it didn't take long to find out what next looked like. It looked like a county inspector showing up on a Wednesday morning with a ledger and a face full of professional neutrality. His name was Aldous Fenn. He was a small, precise man who worked for the county seat and who arrived in a good coat and a bad mood, picking his way across the construction site with the particular displeasure of someone who considers mud a personal affront. He introduced himself to Thorne, asked to see the building plans and the land deed, and proceeded to spend 3 hours measuring things and writing things down in his ledger. Etta watched him work. She kept her distance, but she kept her eyes on the ledger whenever he was close enough. She was not a woman who trusted things she couldn't see. At the end of 3 hours, Fenn closed the ledger and said to Thorne, The eastern foundation wall is showing a variance in setback distance. County ordinance requires 14 feet from the property line. Your wall appears to be at 11. Thorne was very still. We surveyed that line twice. I'm sure you did, Fenn said pleasantly. Nevertheless, the measurement I have is 11 feet and 2 inches. That puts the construction in violation and subject to a stop work order pending correction. Thorne didn't say anything for a long moment. Then he said, What does correction look like? You'd need to move the wall or file for a variance with the county commissioner's office. The variance process takes 4 to 6 weeks. 4 to 6 weeks. Etta heard those words and felt the shape of them. They meant December. They meant the first heavy snow. They meant arriving late to the window that was the whole point of everything they were building. She stepped forward. Mr. Fenn, she said, what survey instrument did you use? He looked at her. There was something in the way he did it that she recognized. The particular adjustment men made in their faces when a woman addressed them on a technical subject. Pardon? Your measurement tool, she said. The chain you used to measure the setback. How long is the chain? He blinked. The standard chain is 66 feet. And when did you last calibrate it? He opened his mouth, then closed it. He looked at Thorne. Then he looked back at Etta. Because, she said, keeping her voice level and her face pleasant, we used a steel tape purchased new from Harlan's in September. If there's a discrepancy of 3 feet in a 14-foot measurement, that's a 20% error, which is a lot, unless one instrument has a calibration problem. Fenn's expression was doing something complicated. Are you questioning county measuring equipment, Mrs. Rowan, she said. I'm questioning the measurement. I'd like to remeasure with both instruments present, with the county deed and the survey stakes we drove in September, before anyone files anything. He looked at her for a moment longer than he needed to. Then he said stiffly, I can come back Friday. Today would be better, she said. We'll stop construction on the east wall until you can verify. But I'd rather verify today than file anything that turns out to be based on a wrong number. He came back at 2 in the afternoon with a second chain and a junior surveyor from the county office, who was young enough to be embarrassed by the whole situation. They remeasured the setback with 3 different instruments while Thorne and Walt and Etta watched. 14 feet and 4 inches. Fenn wrote the number down, said nothing to anyone, and left. Walt looked at Etta. How did you know about the chain calibration? I didn't, she said, but a 3-foot error in a short measurement has to come from somewhere, and equipment is easier to challenge than intent. Walt shook his head slowly. Where'd you learn that? Martin used to survey fence lines, she said. He argued with a county man about a measurement once. He lost, but I remembered the conversation. Thorne was quiet for a moment. Then he said, Crow has someone in the county office. Or he has someone who knows someone, Etta said, which is almost the same thing. We need documentation, he said. Everything we do from here, every measurement, every delivery, every decision, written down and dated. Already doing it, she said, and held up the notebook. He looked at it, then at her. There was something in his face that she was still learning to read. Not quite respect, because respect implied surprise, and she had the sense that Thorne was past being surprised by her. Something steadier than that. All right, he said, let's get back to work. The days that followed had a particular texture to them. The texture of things going mostly right with enough going wrong to keep everyone honest. The chimney for the second fireplace cracked in a cold snap and had to be rebuilt, which cost Walt 4 days and a quantity of profanity that Etta chose to interpret as enthusiasm. A delivery of window glass arrived with 6 panes broken, and the subsequent argument with the supplier took 2 letters and a personal ride from Thorne to resolve. The replacement panes showed up a week late, which pushed the glazing work into the first week of December, which meant the common room was open to the wind for 10 days longer than anyone wanted. Etta managed all of it. Not without frustration, she felt frustration regularly, in the specific form of a tight sensation behind her sternum that she'd come to recognize as her body's response to the gap between what needed to happen and what was actually happening. She just didn't let the frustration do the thinking. She let it tell her there was a problem, and then she went to the notebook and worked the problem out on paper, which was slower and more exhausting than screaming would have been, but produced better results. Clara watched all of this. She was 12 years old, and she had a habit of appearing in doorways when conversations were happening, not eavesdropping exactly, but present in the way perceptive children are present, absorbing. One evening she asked Etta, "Do you get scared?" Etta was doing accounts at the kitchen table, and she looked up. "Yes," she said. "What does it feel like?" She thought about it. "Like the ground is less solid than I thought it was," she said. "Like I took a step and it didn't land where I expected." Clara considered this. "And then what do you do?" "Then I take another step," Etta said. Clara nodded like that was the answer she'd been expecting and went to bed. Etta sat with the accounts for a while longer, running the numbers for the 5th time because the 5th time sometimes showed something the 4th hadn't. Robbie, for his part, had decided that Thorne Mercer was the most interesting person he'd ever encountered, a judgment he expressed by following the man at a distance of approximately 8 feet whenever he was on the property. Thorne bore this with the patience of a man who has spent enough time alone in the mountains to find the presence of a curious 8-year-old more interesting than annoying. He occasionally explained what he was doing, how he was reading the timber for grain before he cut it, why certain knots weakened a board and others didn't, how to look at a stone wall and tell whether the person who built it understood the weight they were handling. Robbie absorbed all of it with the total seriousness of a child who has decided that something matters. One afternoon, Etta found them at the woodpile, Thorne splitting rails with Robbie watching with his arms crossed and his face set in an expression of profound professional evaluation. "He's showing him the angle," Clara said from behind her. "I see that," Etta said. They stood together for a moment watching. Thorne demonstrated the split, then handed the axe to Robbie, who was obviously too small for it, but took it with both hands and tried the stance. Thorne adjusted his grip without making a thing of it. "He's patient," Clara said. "Yes," Etta agreed. She didn't say what she was thinking, which was that it was the first time in 2 years a man had taken that kind of patient time with her son, and the particular feeling that produced in her was one she didn't quite know where to put. She went back to work. The second week of December arrived the way winter arrives in mountain country, not as a change in weather, but as an announcement. The temperature dropped 12 degrees in 2 days, the sky went the color of old pewter, and the wind off the Callaway Range picked up a quality that people in Frost Hollow called the bite, meaning the specific combination of cold and speed that found the gaps in your coat and made them into problems. The crew worked through it, not happily but consistently, which Etta considered better than happy. Happy workers chatted. Consistent workers built things. The interior was close. The sleeping rooms were framed and plastered. The kitchen had its stove, installed on a Tuesday after a 3-hour argument between the stove installer and the stovepipe dimensions that Etta resolved by finding the original manufacturing specification in a catalog she'd written away for in October. The common room had its floor, its tables, rough built by the Kendall brothers from timber they'd cut on the East Ridge line, and its 2 fireplaces, both drawing cleanly since Walt had rebuilt the second chimney. What remained was the stable and the storage barn. The stable was further along than the barn. It was a practical building, low and well insulated, with stalls for 12 horses and a separate area for mules and oxen. Thorne had designed it, and the design showed the kind of thinking that comes from a man who has spent most of his life depending on animals to survive. The stalls were wider than standard, the drainage was carefully planned, and there was a room off the south end for tack and feed that could be heated by a small stove in extreme cold. The storage barn was the problem. They were 3 days behind on the barn, which meant that when the first serious snow came, they'd either have supplies exposed or construction interrupted, or both. Etta went over the schedule every evening that week and kept arriving at the same unhappy arithmetic. On a Thursday evening, she was still at it when Thorne came in from the property. He was carrying cold on him the way outdoor men do. It came through the door with him and stayed in the room for a few minutes. "I know what you're going to say," he said. "The barn," she said. "I talked to Walt. He thinks if we pull 2 men off the finish work on the sleeping rooms and put them on the barn frame, we can get the roof on before the weekend. The sleeping rooms need 3 more days of finish work, which we can do after the barn roof is on, before the snow hits." She looked at him. He was tired. She could see that, in the way he sat, and the way the muscle around his left jaw was doing something it did when he'd been working in cold all day without enough to eat. She'd noticed this over the weeks. He was one of those men who forgot to eat when he was focused. "Did you have supper?" she said. He looked slightly surprised by the question. "Not yet." She got up and went to the stove and put together what was left from the evening's meal: biscuits and salt pork and a jar of the apple preserves Clara had put up in October, and set it on the table without ceremony. He sat down and ate. She went back to the schedule. They worked it out together, which was how most evenings ended. She would lay out the numbers and the sequence. He would identify the practical constraints, which men could do which work, what the material needed, what the weather would probably allow. And between them, they'd arrive at something that was less than ideal and better than disaster, which was the ordinary outcome of planning in circumstances that didn't cooperate. "If the snow holds off until Sunday," she said, "we're all right." "It's going to snow Saturday," he said, with the confidence of a man who had spent enough winters in mountain country that his body had developed its own weather sense. She looked up. "Saturday. By evening, I'd say noon, but the wind's not right yet for a morning storm." She went back to the numbers. "Then we need the barn roof by Friday evening." "I know. Can we do that?" He ate the last biscuit and sat back. "I'll have the crew start at 4 in the morning. Yes, we can do it." She nodded and made a note. He was quiet for a moment. She was still writing when he said, "You know what I've been thinking about?" "The stable drainage," she guessed, because he'd mentioned it twice that week. "The way they talked about you," he said. She stopped writing. She looked up. He wasn't looking at her. He was looking at the table, at the empty plate, at nothing in particular. "In town, the things they said, still say." He paused. "You carry it well." She was quiet for a moment. "I carry it the way you carry a rock in your boot," she said. "You don't get used to it. You just learn to walk anyway." He looked at her then. There was something in his face she hadn't seen before. Not pity, she'd have hated pity. Something more like recognition. The look of someone who has also learned to walk with weight. "I was a joke too," he said. "Different reasons. Man who goes to live alone in the mountains is either a hermit or a failure or both." depending on who you ask. She hadn't expected that. And which were you? He thought about it. Neither. I just wanted to see if I could. He paused. Turns out I could, but it didn't. It wasn't enough. After a while alone, all you've built is a place to be alone in. She went back to her notes, not because she was done with the conversation, but because she needed a moment to process it. There was something in what he'd said that sat differently than she'd expected. That's why you came back, she said. Part of it. And the other part? He stood up and put his coat back on. The other part is standing in your kitchen working on a schedule, he said. Good night, Mrs. Rowan. She looked up. Etta, she said, if we're going to argue about roofing schedules at 9 o'clock at night, you can call me Etta. Something moved across his face that was close to a smile. Good night, Etta. He went out. The cold came back briefly when the door opened, and then the kitchen was just the kitchen again. The stove, the lamp, the notebook with its columns of numbers. She sat with it for a while longer, not working, just sitting. Then she turned back to the schedule and made 2 more notes, because the barn roof wasn't going to solve itself. And Saturday was coming whether they were ready or not. Saturday came, and so did the snow, exactly when Thorne said it would, around mid-afternoon, coming in off the Callaway Range in slow, deliberate curtains that thickened as the temperature dropped. But the barn roof was on by 3 in the afternoon, with 2 hours to spare, the last nail driven by Ed Kendall, who was so cold by that point that his hands were moving by habit rather than sensation. He stood back and looked at it and said, "Done." And the word came out in a cloud of breath that the wind immediately took. The crew spent the next hour moving supplies under cover before the snow accumulated. Etta directed traffic from the center of the staging area. This goes in the barn, that goes in the stable, the window glass under the lean-to, pointing and calling out without stopping, because in the first hour of a serious snowfall, there is no time for hesitation, and she knew it. When it was done, and the men had gone home to their families, and the snow was coming down with more intention, she stood in the doorway of the main lodge and looked out at what they'd built. The structure was still rough in places. There were things unfinished inside, details that would need weeks more work. But the roof was on, the walls were solid, the fireplaces drew, and the stable had 12 stalls ready for animals that needed shelter. They weren't open yet, but they were close enough that she could see it. Thorne came to stand beside her in the doorway. Neither of them said anything for a while, which was something she'd come to appreciate about the man. He didn't fill silence the way some people did, as if silence were an embarrassment. He let it be what it was. "What's left?" he said finally. She'd done the list that morning. Finish work on sleeping rooms 4 and 5, the stable stove installation, inventory and stocking of the kitchen stores. Signage. She paused. And we need a name. He looked at her. You don't have one? I have thoughts, she said. I haven't decided. He looked back out at the snow. What are your thoughts? Summit Crossing, she said. Summit Crossing Lodge. He was quiet for a moment. Because of the pass. Because of the pass, she said, and because it says exactly what it is. Travelers crossing through the summit country stop here. It's not trying to be anything complicated. Summit Crossing Lodge, he said, like he was testing the weight of it. You hate it, she said. No, he said. I think it's right. The snow kept coming. Somewhere in the direction of Frost Hollow, a lamp came on in a window. Some family settling in for an evening, unaware or indifferent to the 2 figures standing in a doorway, looking at the first real snow of the season and thinking about what came next. What came next was trouble. Not the slow kind. Not the kind that arrives through county inspectors and supply interruptions and whisper campaigns at the feed store. The kind that comes at night with lanterns and oil and men who have been paid to make something disappear before it becomes inconvenient. Etta didn't know that yet. She stood in the doorway and looked at the snow and thought about inventory lists and kitchen stores and the particular problem of fitting a sign above a door that wasn't quite plumb. The trouble was already on its way. It just hadn't arrived yet. The trouble arrived on a Wednesday, 11 days before Christmas, in the form of 3 men Etta had never seen before. She noticed them because she noticed everything. It was a habit she'd developed not from paranoia, but from necessity. When you're running a construction site with a shrinking budget and a man like Silas Crow applying pressure from 3 directions, you learn to pay attention to things that don't fit the pattern of the day. Three strangers riding in from the south road in the early afternoon, stopping at the tree line 200 yards from the property and sitting there for 20 minutes before riding on. That was a thing that didn't fit. She mentioned it to Thorne that evening. He listened without interrupting, which was his way. Then he said, "What did the horses look like?" "Two bays and a gray. The gray was a good animal, better than the men riding it." "Hired," he said. "That's what I thought." He was quiet for a moment, looking at the fire in the common room hearth. They'd started using the lodge in the evenings over the past week, working at the big table by the fireplace because it was warmer than the main house kitchen, and the light was better. Clara and Robbie were in the house. The lodge felt different at night, bigger and quieter, with the sounds of the building settling into cold and the wind coming off the pass with its particular sound. "How close are we?" he said. "To opening?" She already knew the number. 9 days if everything goes right, 12 if it doesn't. "We open in 9 days, he said. "I know." She paused. "That's why they came to look." He nodded slowly. "Crow knows if we open before the heavy snow, the reputation builds itself. Every traveler that comes through talks. By spring, we're established. And if we don't open," she said, "if something happens to the building before we do, we won't have the money or the time to rebuild before the season's over." He looked at her. "I'll start keeping watch at night." "You can't do it alone." "I can cover the main building and the stable," he said. "The storage barn worries me more." "I'll talk to Walt," she said. "He's been staying in town, but I think if I ask him, he'll sleep here through the week." "Don't tell him why," Thorne said. "Not all of it." She looked at him. "Why not?" "Because if it gets around that we're expecting trouble, Crow finds out we're expecting it, and he adjusts. Right now he thinks we don't know what's coming." She thought about that. It was the kind of strategic thinking she didn't come to as naturally as he did. She was better at the chess of resources and logistics than the chess of other people's intentions. "All right," she said. "I'll tell Walt we need someone on site for the final push." Walt agreed without much persuasion, mostly because he was the kind of man who liked being close to work he'd done well, and the stonework on Summit Crossing Lodge was the best masonry of his career, and he knew it. He moved a bedroll into the storage barn on Thursday, and by Friday had established a routine of checking the site before he slept, and once in the middle of the night, which Etta knew because she was doing the same thing from the main house. She was not sleeping well. She hadn't said this to anyone, but the truth of it was that she was lying awake most nights with the specific restless quality of someone who has too many variables in motion and not enough certainty about any of them. The numbers were good enough. The building was close enough. The crew was solid. And none of that kept her from staring at the ceiling at 2 in the morning, thinking about all the ways things could still go wrong. On Saturday, 4 miners came through on their way down from a high camp they'd been working since August. They were tired, underfed, and in the specific bad temper of men who have been eating their own cooking for 4 months. They came up the road from the pass and saw the lodge and stopped. One of them, a broad-shouldered man named Gideon, who seemed to speak for the group, looked at the sign above the door that Thorne had installed just that morning. Summit Crossing Lodge. The letters were clean and black against planed pine. "Is this open?" Gideon called out. Etta was in the stable checking a water trough installation. She came out and looked at the 4 men. "Not yet," she said. "Another week or so." Gideon looked at his companions. Then he looked back at her. "We've been riding since 4 this morning. The next lodging is 18 miles south, and it's dark in 4 hours." She looked at the 4 of them. They were, all of them, the kind of tired that went past the body into something more essential. One of the younger men was favoring his left side in a way that suggested a rib issue. "I can give you a meal and a place to sleep," she said. "The sleeping rooms aren't finished yet. Rooms 4 and 5 are still rough, but rooms 1 through 3 have beds, and they're warm. Kitchen's working." Gideon looked at her with the measuring expression of a man who's been taken advantage of enough times to be cautious. "How much?" 50 cents a man for the night," she said. "That includes supper and breakfast and stable for your horses." He thought about it for about 4 seconds. "Done," he said. She put them in rooms 1 and 2, the 2 men in each room, and she made supper, salt pork, beans, cornbread, and the last of the apple preserves. And she charged them 50 cents a head and wrote the amounts in the notebook, because the notebook was the record of everything. And she had the instinct that these 4 miners were going to become, in a small way, the first page of what Summit Crossing Lodge was going to be. They ate like men who hadn't eaten well in months, which they probably hadn't. The one with the rib issue turned out to have taken a bad fall 3 weeks earlier and was dealing with it badly. Etta looked at the rib situation after supper because she'd set a broken rib on her own farmhand the previous winter and knew roughly what she was looking at. She wrapped it with strips of cloth and told him to stop sleeping on his side, and the young man looked at her with the gratitude of someone who'd been hurting for a while and hadn't admitted it. Thorne watched all of this from across the common room with an expression she couldn't quite read. Later, after the miners were in their rooms and the fire was banked, he said, "You just opened the lodge." "I took in 4 guests," she said. "Same thing." She considered it. "We're $2 richer, and they'll tell people where they slept." He shook his head. Not negatively, just the way you shake your head at something that doesn't surprise you but pleases you anyway. "You're going to be good at this." "I'm already good at this," she said, and went to update the notebook. The miners left Sunday morning after breakfast, and Gideon, at the door, said to Etta, "There are 2 more parties coming down from the Callaway camps before the snow closes the high trails. I'll tell them where you are." "I'd appreciate that," she said. He started to ride out, then stopped and looked back. "How long has this place been here?" "We built it this fall," she said. He looked at the lodge, the solid walls, the stone chimneys, the sign above the door, and then at her, with the same expression people had when something defied their expectation of what it should be. "Huh," he said, and then he rode. That was Sunday. On Monday, the finishing crew came back and worked through the interior details in rooms 4 and 5. Etta organized the kitchen stores, going through every item in inventory against her list, checking quantities, calculating what they'd need for the first 2 weeks at full capacity. She'd been conservative in her estimates of what full capacity looked like. 30 travelers at peak, 15 at regular. She ordered based on 15 and made note of where to expand quickly if volume exceeded that. Tuesday was when the Kendall brothers started on the exterior trim work, the last piece of visible construction that would make the building look finished rather than in progress. Ed Kendall was up on a ladder with a mallet when he called down, "Mrs. Rowan, those men are back." She was at the staging area. She looked up, then toward the tree line. 2 of the 3 men from the previous week. Same horses. 1 bay, 1 gray. They weren't pretending to be passing through this time. They were just sitting in the tree line, watching, not bothering to disguise what they were doing. She went to find Thorne. He was at the east side of the property checking the foundation drainage, which had become a minor obsession of his since the heavy snow had settled and the melt runoff was doing things he wanted to understand before spring. She told him about the men in the tree line. He didn't go look. "They want us to know," he said. "I know," she said. "They're not hiding. Crow's telling us the clock is running." "Then what do we do?" He thought for a moment. "Nothing different," he said. "We keep working. We open when we said we'd open. We don't go to Crow and we don't make any move that tells him we're rattled." "I'm not rattled," she said. "I know." He looked at her. "But those men in the tree line aren't the problem. They're the announcement. The problem comes later." She understood that. "How much later?" "When does the lodge open?" he said. 9 days, she said, then corrected herself. 8 now. "Crow won't wait until after you open," he said. "He needs to act before. Probably in the next 4 or 5 days." She let out a slow breath. "Then we need to not be sleeping when they come." "No," he said. "We don't." That evening, she wrote a letter. She addressed it to James Alcott, the county sheriff in Mill Haven, 22 miles east. She wrote it carefully, in the plain, factual style she used for business correspondence, and she described everything: the interference with the lumber delivery, the county inspector with the wrong measurement, the men watching from the tree line, without editorializing or accusing Silas Crow by name, only stating facts in their sequence. She gave the letter to Thorne to review. He read it twice. "You're not naming Crow directly." "I don't have proof," she said. "Yet. If I name him without proof, the letter looks like a grudge complaint." "Smart," he said. "I want the sheriff to have this letter before anything happens," she said, "so that when something does happen, he already knows the history." Thorne handed the letter back. "I'll write it to Millhaven tomorrow." She sealed the letter and gave it to him. Then she sat down at the table with a cup of coffee that had gone cold while she was writing and looked at the common room around her. The stone fireplace, the plain tables, the windows that had taken 3 weeks and a fight with a supplier to get right. The room had a quality to it at night that she hadn't fully anticipated when she was planning it on paper. It was warm in the specific way that a room is warm when it's been built right. Not just heated, but sheltered, the walls doing what walls are supposed to do. She was sitting there when the door opened and Clara came in from the main house. "Can't sleep," Clara said. "Neither could I at your age," Etta said, which was not quite true. At 12 she'd slept perfectly well, but which felt like the right thing to say. Clara sat down across from her and wrapped her hands around the cold coffee cup that Etta pushed across the table. "Are those men going to try to burn it down?" Etta looked at her daughter. She thought about softening the answer and then decided that Clara had earned the real one. "Someone might try," she said. "Mr. Mercer and Walt are keeping watch. We've written to the sheriff." Clara was quiet for a moment. What would they do if they did burn it? "They won't," Etta said. "But if they did," Etta looked at her, "then we'd figure out what came next." Clara considered that. She had the look of someone doing a private calculation. "I want to help," she said. "With the watch." "You're 12. "I know what a fire smells like before you can see it," Clara said. "Papa taught me. He said the smell comes first before the smoke, if you know what to look for." Etta was quiet for a long moment. "You can sleep in the lodge," she said finally, "in room 1, closest to the common room. If you smell something wrong, you come and wake me immediately. You don't investigate. You come get me." Clara nodded. "All right." They sat together for a while in the warm room, not talking much. Outside, the wind moved off the mountains and made its November sound against the walls, and the walls held. Thorne rode to Millhaven on Wednesday, delivered the letter, and came back by evening with a response from Sheriff Alcott. A brief, carefully worded note that said the sheriff had received the information and was aware of the situation and would look into the matter of the county inspector's visit, and that if Mrs. Rowan had occasion to contact him urgently, his deputy held office on Tuesdays and Thursdays in Frost Hollow. It wasn't a cavalry response, but it was a response that said someone outside their circle of 2 knew the shape of things. Wednesday night passed without incident. So did Thursday. Friday was the day 3 men came to ask about work. They arrived mid-morning, presented themselves at the main lodge door, and asked Etta if she needed any additional hands for the finish work. They were presentable enough, clean faces, decent boots, and the kind of easy manner that people practice rather than come by naturally. Something about the ease of them struck her wrong immediately. She told them she had a full crew. The one who seemed to be doing the talking, lean, sandy-haired, with pale eyes that moved around the property more than the conversation required, said they'd heard she was opening soon and wondered if there might be work ongoing once the lodge was operational. "We take on staff when we need them," she said. "Any chance we could look around while we're here?" he said. "Get a sense of the place in case we want to apply proper once you're open." She looked at him for a moment. "No," she said pleasantly, "but thank you for stopping." She closed the door and went immediately to find Thorne. He listened, then said, "The pale-eyed one. Did he have a scar on his left hand?" She thought back. "Yes, along the outside of the palm." He was quiet for a moment, and then he said, "His name is Deering. He works for a man named Culp who runs a contracting outfit out of Aldermore. Culp does work for hire that isn't always the kind of work you put your name on." "You know him?" "I've crossed paths with men he's worked with," Thorne said. "In the mountains you hear things." He paused. "Deering doesn't ask about employment. He scouts." She felt something drop in her stomach. Not fear exactly, but the specific feeling of a thing she'd known was coming, becoming suddenly concrete. "When?" she said. "Not tonight," he said. "They'll want to know where everyone sleeps, where the weak points are. They came today to learn the layout. They didn't get inside. They saw enough from the yard." He paused. "Saturday night. That's my read." "Why Saturday?" "Sunday's the first day you plan to accept regular guests. Gideon will have told people. There may be travelers on the road by Sunday morning." He looked at her. "Crow wants it gone before then." She stood very still for a moment, going through the shape of it. "What do we do?" "We don't change anything visible," he said. "Same schedule, same crew, same lighting at night. We don't want Deering riding by and seeing that the watch has doubled." "But the watch doubles," she said. "Yes." He paused. "I need to send a message to 2 men I trust. They can be here by Saturday afternoon." "Who are they?" Brothers named Halloran, Amos and Cleet. They've done work with me in the mountains. They're not gentlemen, but they're straight. They'll do what they say they'll do." She looked at him. "And what are we asking them to do?" "Be here, in the dark. If someone comes onto this property with fire, we meet them before they reach the buildings." She thought about Clara in room 1, about Robbie in the main house, about Walt's bedroll in the storage barn, and the Halloran brothers she hadn't met, and the lean man with pale eyes who'd stood in her doorway that morning, measuring everything he could see. "Send for them," she said. Saturday came in cold and clear, which was the kind of weather that made distances feel shorter and sound carry farther. The crew did their usual work through the morning and early afternoon, and at 3 o'clock, Etta released them for the weekend with their pay, same as every Saturday, nothing different. The Halloran brothers arrived at 4. They were big men, both of them. Amos was older, heavier, with a face mostly one. Cleet was younger and quieter, with the specific stillness of someone who moves carefully because he's learned the cost of moving wrong. They shook Etta's hand without comment, looked over the property in the systematic way of men evaluating a situation rather than admiring a building, and spoke quietly with Thorne for 20 minutes near the stable. Etta used the last daylight to do something she'd been putting off. She went to the storage barn, which held 3 months of supplies they'd spent the fall accumulating: flour, salt pork, dried beans, sugar, lamp oil, grain for the stable, tools, lumber for the spring expansion she was already planning. She walked the barn slowly, looking at what was there, and she felt a kind of anger that was cleaner than anything she'd felt in weeks. Not the complicated anger of someone dealing with insult or dismissal, but a simple, direct anger at the idea that someone might try to take this from her. She'd spent 20 years building a life. She'd watched the first version of it erode. She'd built this one with her hands and her mind in the best 14 hours of every day since September, and she was not going to watch it burn. She went back to the lodge and she made supper for 6. Herself, Thorne, Walt, Amos, Cleet, and she brought Clara in from the main house because Clara had earned a place at this table. They ate and they talked about ordinary things, the way people do when they're waiting for something difficult, because talking about ordinary things is a way of affirming that there will be ordinary things on the other side of whatever's coming. After supper, she put Robbie to bed in the main house and locked the door and gave Clara a whistle on a cord around her neck. "If you hear anything wrong," she said, "anything at all, you blow that." Clara put the whistle around her neck and looked at her mother with the composure of a 12-year-old who has been waiting for a chance to be useful. "I will," she said. The night settled in. Thorne took the north side of the property, where the tree line came closest to the lodge. Amos Halloran went to the storage barn, where Walt was already positioned. Cleet took the south approach, where the road came up from Frost Hollow. Etta stayed in the lodge, in the common room, in the dark, because the lodge was what they were protecting, and she wasn't going to protect it from the main house. She sat in the common room in a chair pulled back from the window, where she could see the yard without being silhouetted by any light source. She had no weapon except a fireplace poker, which she held across her knees, and she sat with the specific quality of stillness that comes not from peace, but from decision, from having decided what she would do and being ready to do it. The first hour passed. The fire in the hearth burned down to coals, and she let it, because light was a liability. The darkness settled into the room completely, and her eyes adjusted, and the yard outside the window became a pattern of shapes she could read. Nothing. She was starting to wonder, around the second hour, if Thorne had been wrong about the timing, when she smelled it. Not smoke. Not yet. Something under smoke. The particular sharp smell of lamp oil, the kind that doesn't belong in a yard at midnight. She was at the door before she'd consciously decided to move. She came out into the cold and the dark, and she stood still and breathed through her nose and located the smell. It was coming from the left, from the direction of the storage barn. She moved fast and quiet, the way she'd learned to move on a farm. Purposeful, without being loud, covering ground without announcing it. She went around the south side of the lodge, and she saw the shapes before she heard anything. 2 men at the storage barn door. One of them was Deering. She recognized the lean silhouette and the particular way he moved. The other man she didn't know. Deering had a lantern, unlit, in his left hand and a bottle of oil in his right, and he was doing something to the barn's side wall. She didn't call out. She set herself between them and the main lodge, and she said, loudly enough to carry, "Walt, now!" What happened in the next 4 seconds was fast and not clean. Walt came out of the barn from the inside, which Deering hadn't expected, and the man with Deering ran and ran hard, and Deering himself spun and had a moment of genuine confusion when he found Etta Rowan standing 10 feet from him in the dark. He was not a small man. He was the lean kind of strong that spends time outdoors, and he looked at her and made a calculation that she could see him making, the calculation of whether she was a real obstacle or an inconvenience. He moved toward her. She moved into him instead of away, which was the thing he hadn't calculated for. She was not a small woman. She was broad and she was strong from 4 months of hauling stone and timber, and she put her shoulder into him with the full deliberate weight of someone who has decided to hold a position. He went back a step and she stayed with him, and in that moment Amos Halloran came around the barn corner at a run and the calculation changed entirely. Deering dropped the bottle. He threw the lantern at the barn wall. It hit and broke but didn't ignite, the wick unlit, and he went for the tree line at a sprint. He got 8 feet before Thorne stepped out of the dark in front of him. The two men stood facing each other for a moment. Thorne was still. Deering was breathing hard. "You don't want to run," Thorne said. "You don't know these woods, and I do." Deering believed him. He stopped. The third man, the one who'd been watching the south approach, turned out to be Cleet's problem, and Cleet handled it efficiently and without drama, appearing with the man's arm behind his back, and the man's opinion about the whole situation being expressed in language Etta chose to ignore. They had 3 men. The third one cracked first. He was younger, clearly less committed to silence than Deering, and when Amos Halloran looked at him for about 30 seconds without saying anything, the young man decided that loyalty to Silas Crow was not worth what it was costing him. "Crow," he said. "Silas Crow. He paid us. $50 for the barn, and 20 more if the main building went too." Nobody said anything for a moment. Deering said to the young man with profound contempt, "Shut your mouth." "He already knows," the young man said. "She already knew it was coming." Etta looked at Deering. "I'm going to ask you once," she said. "Did Silas Crow send you here tonight?" Deering looked at her for a long time. She could see him deciding. He was a man who sold his work, and he was calculating whether Crow could protect him or would, and how that calculation compared to the other thing, the thing that was standing in front of him that he hadn't expected to find at this particular barn at this particular hour. "Yes," he said. She nodded. "Thank you." She looked at Thorne. He was watching her, and she could see that he understood what she was thinking, because in the 2 months they'd been working together, they'd developed the particular efficiency of people who have spent enough time in the same project to understand each other's thinking. "We hold them until morning," she said. "Then we ride to Millhaven." Cleet and Amos kept the 3 men in the storage barn overnight, and nobody slept much, and by the time the sky started to go gray, Walt had a fire going in the lodge kitchen and coffee on, and a look on his face that said he'd had an interesting night and was still working out how he felt about it. Clara came in at first light from room 1 and found Etta at the common room table with the notebook and a look on her face that Clara recognized. Not relief, not triumph, just the focused steadiness of someone moving to the next problem. "Are they caught?" Clara said. "3 of them," Etta said. Clara sat down. "Is it over?" Etta looked at her daughter. She thought about Silas Crow sitting in Frost Hollow with his warehouses and his accounts and his network of people who owed him things. And she thought about a county sheriff 22 miles east who now had a letter describing the sequence of events. And she thought of about 3 men in her storage barn who had said a name out loud. "The worst of it's over," she said. "What comes next is different." "Different how?" Etta looked out the window at the gray morning light coming across the property. The lodge stood in it, solid and unchanged, the same as it had been before midnight, the same as it would be at noon. The barn was intact. The stable was intact. The sign above the door still said Summit Crossing Lodge in clean black letters against planed pine. "Harder to ignore," she said. "What we do next." She went to the kitchen and poured 2 cups of coffee and brought one back to Clara and one to herself. And she sat down and opened the notebook to a fresh page because there was work to do, and it was not going to wait for sunrise. Sheriff James Alcott rode into the Summit Crossing property at 9 in the morning with a deputy named Briggs and an expression that said he'd read Etta's letter carefully and was now revising his expectations of what he'd find when he got here. What he found was 3 men sitting in the storage barn under the watch of Amos and Cleet Halloran, a broken lamp and an unbroken oil bottle in the barnyard as physical evidence, and Etta Rowan at the common room table with a notebook that contained a dated, sequential record of every event going back to the first lumber delivery interference in October. Alcott was a methodical man. He was in his mid-50s, thick through the chest, with the patient quality of someone who had spent enough years in law enforcement to know that the first version of any story was rarely the complete one. He looked at the evidence in the yard, talked to each of the 3 men separately, read through the pages Etta showed him, and then sat down at the common room table and asked questions for 40 minutes. He was particularly interested in the young man whose name turned out to be Ferris, and who had clearly made a decision in the cold of the storage barn overnight that his future was better served by talking than by silence. Ferris had been specific. $50 for the barn, 20 more if the main building caught. Paid in advance, half the amount, the rest on confirmation of the job. The man who'd paid him was not Silas Crow directly. It was a man named Greer who worked in Crow's warehouse office. But Ferris had been present for a conversation between Greer and Crow that left no ambiguity about who the instruction came from. Alcott wrote all of it down. He wrote carefully, like a man who understood that what went on paper in the next hour was going to matter in a room he hadn't been to yet. When he was done, he closed his notebook and looked at Etta. "This Greer, you have any documentation of a connection between him and Crow's business operation?" "I can get it," she said. "Crow's warehouse accounts are filed with the county clerk in Mill Haven. Greer is listed as a salaried employee. That's public record." Alcott looked at her with a slight adjustment in his expression that she'd come to recognize over the course of the morning. The look of a man recalibrating. "You've already checked." "I checked 3 weeks ago," she said, "when I wrote the first letter." He nodded slowly. He looked at Thorne, who had been sitting at the far end of the table through the whole conversation, quiet and present. "Mr. Mercer, anything you want to add?" "She's covered it," Thorne said. Alcott almost smiled. He stood up and put his hat on. "I'll take these 3 men to Mill Haven. Ferris will give a statement. The other 2—" He paused. "Deering's worked for Culp's outfit before. We know who he is. He'll lawyer up, but what the boy says puts him at the scene with materials for arson. That's enough to hold him." He looked at Etta. "As for Silas Crow, I want to be straight with you. What I have right now is a chain of testimony that points to him. That's not nothing, but it's not the same as documentation." "I understand," she said. "The county inspector situation is more useful to me than you might think," he said. "A false measurement filed with the county office is a document. It has Fenn's signature on it. If Fenn was acting on Crow's instruction, that's a paper trail." Etta reached into the notebook and produced the receipt Harlan had written when Thorne paid the debt, the copy of the remeasurement with the corrected number, and the original stop-work threat in Fenn's handwriting, which she'd asked Fenn to put in writing at the time because she'd had the instinct it would matter. Alcott looked at the papers. He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "Mrs. Rowan, did you plan this?" "I planned to document everything that happened," she said, "in case it became useful." He folded the papers carefully and put them in his coat pocket. "I'll be in touch," he said. He nodded to Thorne, nodded to Etta, and went to collect his prisoners. Thorne and Etta stood in the yard and watched the sheriff's party ride south toward the Frost Hollow Road. Amos Halloran came to stand beside them, his breath making clouds in the cold morning air. "You think it sticks?" Amos said. "Some of it," Thorne said. "The inspector situation sticks," Etta said. "A falsified county document is harder to talk your way around than a hired man's testimony." Amos nodded slowly. "What does Crow do now?" She'd been thinking about that since 4 in the morning. "He lawyers up," she said. "He distances himself from Greer. He pays whatever fine they put on the arson charge and calls it a misunderstanding." She paused. "But he loses time dealing with it, and while he's dealing with it, we open." Amos looked at her and then at Thorne with an expression of mild appreciation. "She's cold about it," he said. "She's right about it," Thorne said. The lodge opened on Sunday, as Etta had planned, not with ceremony. She didn't put up extra decoration or make it a speech or do anything that would give the opening a quality it hadn't earned yet. She put fresh wood in the fireplaces, made sure the kitchen was stocked and the stable was ready, and she went outside and straightened the sign above the door because the left side had dropped a quarter-inch overnight, and it bothered her. The first official guests were a family, a man named Burgess, his wife, and their two daughters, coming down from a ranch in the High Valley where they'd been trying to winter over and had decided, after the previous week's storm, that the decision had been wrong. They arrived cold, and the younger daughter was crying from the chill, and the older one had the fixed expression of a child who has decided that crying is not an option, but is finding the decision difficult. Etta put them in rooms 1 and 2, gave the girls warm milk from the small supply she'd kept for Clara and Robbie, and had supper on the table within 40 minutes of their arrival. Mrs. Burgess, a quiet woman named Helen, who had the specific competence of someone who has been managing hard situations for a long time, looked at the common room and the fire and the table and said, quietly, to Etta, "How long has this been here?" "Since this week," Etta said. Helen Burgess looked at her. "You built this." "We built it. This fall." "Yes." Helen was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "I heard about this place from a miner named Gideon. He said it was run by a woman who knew what she was doing." She looked at the room again. He wasn't wrong. That was Sunday. By the following Thursday, Summit Crossing Lodge had housed 23 guests. Not all at once. The capacity moved in and out with the rhythm of mountain travel, people arriving in small groups and leaving the next morning, or staying an extra day when the weather made the road south look worse than the bed they were already in. A party of 6 miners, a freighter and his 2 hired men, a physician from the east who was relocating to a practice in a town 3 counties west, and who ended up staying 2 nights because his wagon needed a wheel repair that Walt, demonstrating skills beyond masonry, was able to help with. 2 women traveling together who said they were sisters, and who Etta suspected were not, but who were polite and paid promptly, and whose business was their own. Thorne managed the stable and the exterior operation with the same unhurried competence he brought to everything. He was good with travelers, not warm, exactly, not the kind of man who made people feel welcomed by personality, but reliable in a way that people noticed. If he said the horse would be ready at 6, the horse was ready at 6. If he said the road south was passable, it was passable. After a week, Etta noticed that men who'd stayed once made a point of asking for him specifically when they came back, which several of them did. The word was spreading. She could see it in the pattern of arrivals, people who had clearly been told about the lodge specifically rather than finding it by accident. Gideon had been as good as his word, and the miners coming down from the Callaway camps were arriving with the lodge's name already in their mouths. A rancher from the East Valley came through and said he'd heard about Summit Crossing from a freighter he'd met on the road 2 counties over. 2 counties, he said to Etta, with mild amazement. "Word travels with the travelers," she said. The money was doing something she'd planned for but hadn't let herself believe in until she was looking at the actual numbers. She kept the accounts in the notebook, updated every evening, and the column that said income was growing at a rate that meant, if the pace held, the construction debt would be cleared by March. She went over the numbers twice every night because she didn't trust any number she hadn't checked twice. In Frost Hollow, the reaction was harder to read. She went to town on a Wednesday morning for supplies, and she was aware, as she moved down the main street, of a change in the quality of attention she received. Not warmth. Not yet. Some of these people had been openly contemptuous of her for years, and that didn't evaporate in a season. But something had shifted in the texture of it. People who had previously looked through her were now looking at her, which sounds like a small distinction, but isn't. Ed Phelps at the feed store gave her a fair price on a bulk order of oats without her having to negotiate for it, which he had never done before. She accepted it without comment because making a thing of it would have complicated what she wanted from him. Margaret Delaney from the boarding house was at Harlan's when Etta came in for dry goods, and there was a moment of unavoidable proximity at the counter. Margaret said, with the specific tone of someone who has decided that a revised position needs to be communicated but is uncertain how to do it gracefully, "I heard you've had considerable traffic through the lodge." "We've been busy," Etta said. That's good." Margaret paused. "The winter's been hard on the boarding house. Travelers who used to stop here are going further up the road now." Etta looked at her. She understood what Margaret was saying, which was not quite an apology and not quite a complaint, but somewhere in the uncomfortable territory between them. We serve a different need, Etta said. We're on the pass road. Travelers coming through the Callaway Range stop with us because we're the first shelter after the high country. They'd have had to come another 8 miles south to reach you. Yes, Margaret said. That's true. There was a moment of silence. Then Margaret said, I heard about the trouble. The men who came onto your property. It's being handled, Etta said. Silas. Margaret stopped herself. You don't have to say it, Etta said. Margaret looked at her with an expression that Etta was surprised to find was close to genuine discomfort. I was one of the people who... I said things, early on, about you and Mr. Mercer. I know, Etta said. I'm not asking you to... I know, Etta said again, not unkindly. She picked up her dry goods and settled the account with Harlan. Good morning, Mrs. Delaney. She drove the wagon back to the lodge and unloaded the supplies herself because the crew was occupied with the stable expansion, and she didn't want to pull anyone off it, and she thought about Margaret Delaney's face in that moment of discomfort and found that she felt less about it than she'd expected to. Not nothing, she wasn't made of stone, but less than the years of accumulated contempt should have produced. It was possible, she thought, that carrying a grudge required a kind of energy she'd been directing elsewhere for so long that she'd lost the habit of it. She was putting away the last of the dry goods when Thorne came in from the stable. How's town? He said. Interesting, she said. Margaret Delaney almost apologized to me. He looked at her. Almost. Almost is what she had, Etta said. I accepted it. He poured himself a cup of coffee from the pot on the stove and leaned against the kitchen doorframe. Sheriff Alcott sent a message this morning while you were out, he said. Fenn is cooperating. He says Crow told him to find a violation on the property or invent one. Fenn chose invent. She set down the flour sack she was holding. He said that in a statement? Signed, Thorne said. She was quiet for a moment. What happens to Crow? Alcott thinks a fine, maybe a period of restricted business operation. The county doesn't move fast on men like Crow. He has connections and he'll use them. He paused. But the Fenn statement is public record once it's filed. People will know what he did. She thought about that. In a town like Frost Hollow, in a county where business reputation was the currency everything else ran on, a signed statement saying you'd instructed a county official to fabricate a violation against a neighbor was a different kind of damage than a fine. It was the kind of damage that compounded. And Deering? She said. Arson charge. He'll take a plea and serve some time. Thorne paused. Ferris cooperated fully. Alcott thinks he'll get reduced charges. She nodded. She picked up the flour sack again and put it where it belonged. How's the stable expansion coming? He looked at her for a moment. The look she'd come to understand was his version of noticing a thing he chose not to say. East wall is framing, 2 more days. Good. She pulled out the notebook. We have a group of 7 coming Friday. A cattle rancher named Beaumont and his crew moving a late herd south. They'll need stabling for at least 12 animals. I'll have it ready, he said. She believed him. The Beaumont party arrived Friday evening in the specific state of controlled exhaustion that belongs to men who have been moving livestock through early winter weather. There were 7 of them, plus a cook named Aurelio who immediately took an interest in Etta's kitchen setup and spent 20 minutes examining her stove installation with the focused appreciation of a professional looking at a colleague's work. Beaumont himself was a large, weathered man of about 60, with the quality of someone who had made most of his decisions on horseback and wasn't entirely comfortable making them indoors. He sat at the common room table with a cup of coffee and looked around the room with the assessing eye of a man who evaluates infrastructure the way other people evaluate people. How many can you put up? He said to Etta. 30 at full capacity, she said. We're at 12 sleeping spots currently. We're adding 8 more in the spring expansion. Good kitchen? Come see it, she said. She showed him the kitchen, which was her particular pride. Not because it was large or fancy, because it was neither, but because it was organized in the way that a professional kitchen should be, with every item in a logical place and nothing stored where it couldn't be reached quickly. Aurelio, who was still in the kitchen examining the stove, looked up when they came in and said to Beaumont, in a tone of genuine respect, "She's got it right." Beaumont looked at the kitchen and then at Etta. You do the cooking yourself? For now, she said. I'm looking for a second cook, someone who can handle volume when we're at capacity. Beaumont turned to Aurelio. You know anyone? Anyone? Aurelio thought. There's a woman in Carver's Bend, Marta. She's been doing boarding house cooking, but she's worth more than that. Etta looked at him. Would she be interested in a position? Might be, he said, if the kitchen's like this. She made a note in the notebook. After supper, Beaumont sat across from her at the common room table and said what he'd been getting to for an hour. I move 2 herds a year through this pass. Spring going up, fall going down. I've been stopping in Frost Hollow for both, which adds 2 days to the drive each direction. He paused. If your operation can handle the stock and the crew, I'd rather stop here. Etta looked at him steadily. What does your crew need? Hot food 3 times a day when we're stopped. Stabling for 20 animals minimum. A place where my men can sleep that isn't a barn floor. He paused. And I'll need a blacksmith available. I lose a shoe on the drive. I need it fixed same day. I don't have a blacksmith on staff yet, she said. I have one I can call on in Frost Hollow within 2 hours. Close enough for now, he said. I'll have a resident smith by spring, she said, because she'd already been planning it, and this conversation made it a priority rather than an aspiration. Beaumont looked at her. You're building bigger than this. Yes, she said. He was quiet for a moment. How'd you get the land? It was my husband's, she said. He bought it for almost nothing because no one else wanted it. Smart man, Beaumont said. He was, she said. In some ways. She paused. Not in all of them. Beaumont nodded in the way of a man who knew better than to push past the edge of that. They settled on a rate for the Beaumont party's 2-night stay, and when Etta wrote the number in the notebook that evening, it was the largest single transaction Summit Crossing Lodge had recorded. She looked at it for a moment and then moved on to the next column. December became the pattern of what January and February would be. The snow in the high country pushed traffic down through the pass in waves, and each wave brought Summit Crossing Lodge a different set of people who needed what it offered. Miners and ranchers and freighters and the occasional traveling merchant and, once, a circuit judge named Harward, who was the most demanding guest Etta had handled yet, particular about his bed linen, particular about the temperature of his coffee, particular about noise levels in the hall after 9 in the evening. She met every demand without visible irritation, because Judge Harward was the kind of man whose opinion traveled further than his horse, and when he left on his 3rd morning, he told Etta that Summit Crossing Lodge was the best accommodation he'd found west of the Aldermore County line. She thanked him, charged him the standard rate, and went to find Thorne. The judge is gone, she said. I noticed, he said. He was replacing a hinge on the stable door that had been giving trouble. How'd we do? He called us the best accommodation west of the Aldermore line. Thorne looked up. Something moved across his face, something quiet and genuine. That'll travel, he said. It will, she said. I also think we need a bathing room. He asked twice. Thorne put the hinge back on the door. You want a bathing room? I want it by March, she said, before the spring drive traffic. He looked at her for a long moment. Where? She showed him in the notebook. She'd already sketched the layout, tucked it in behind the accounts pages because she'd been thinking about it for a week. He looked at the sketch, then at the back wall of the lodge, and she could see him doing the construction calculation in his head the way he always did, measuring things in his mind the way other men used instruments. 2 months, he said. If Walt comes back. Walt's already agreed, she said. He wants to do the tile work. He says it's a challenge. Thorne shook his head. You already asked him. Last week, she said, when he came to check the chimney. He went back to the hinge, but she could see the line of his shoulders doing something that, on a less contained man, would have been a smile. All right, he said. January brought a blizzard that shut the pass for 4 days. Those 4 days were the lodge at maximum stress. Every sleeping room full. The common room occupied by travelers who couldn't move on and were dealing with the particular frustration of being stopped by weather, which is different from being stopped by choice. Etta managed the situation the way she managed everything, which was not by being cheerful about it, but by being clear. She set a rotation for the common room seating so that everyone had a place to eat. She rationed the lamp oil without making the rationing feel punitive. She organized a card game on the second evening that kept 8 men occupied for 3 hours and reduced the ambient tension in the room considerably. On the 3rd day, a man named Hollis, who'd been the most vocal about his impatience, came to find her at the kitchen and said, You've got a full house of unhappy people, and I haven't seen you lose your temper once. Losing my temper doesn't open the pass any faster, she said. He laughed, a genuine one. No, he said. I suppose it doesn't. She gave him a cup of coffee, and he went back to the common room a quieter man. Thorne, who had been managing the stable during the blizzard with the kind of focused practicality that a 4-day storm required, came in on the 4th evening when the wind had finally gone down and sat at the kitchen table and put his head in his hands for a moment. Not long, just a moment, the specific gesture of exhaustion that a person allows themselves in private. She put a plate of food in front of him without comment. He ate, and after a while he said, "We're going to need another hand in the stable by spring, someone full-time." "I know," she said. "I've been asking around." "And a cook, like Aurelio said." "I've written to Marta in Carver's Bend," she said. "She's interested. She's coming to look at the kitchen next week." He looked at her. "When did you write?" "During the blizzard," she said. "Second day?" He shook his head slowly. "You wrote a hiring letter during a 4-day blizzard while you were running a full house." "It was quiet in the evenings," she said. He looked at her for a long moment, the specific look she'd come to think of as the one he used when the world had done something he hadn't expected, and he was deciding how to feel about it. "Etta," he said. "What?" "This is going to be something," he said. "What we're building. It's going to be—" He paused. "More than I planned for." She looked at him across the table. He was a tired man who had spent 4 days in a cold stable and wasn't good at saying things directly. And what he was saying, she understood, was more than the sentence said. "I know," she said. He nodded. He finished the food. He said goodnight and went to check the stable one last time before sleeping, because he was the kind of man who checked things one last time before sleeping. She sat with the notebook and the accounts, and the familiar sound of the lodge settling into the cold, and she thought about what "more than I planned for" meant when you said it about a life. The news about Silas Crow came in February, delivered by Harlan Briggs, who rode out from town on a Tuesday morning with the slightly breathless quality of a man who has been waiting for the right moment to say something and has decided this is it. Alcott had filed the charges, the falsified county document, the arson conspiracy, the witness statements. Crow had hired 2 lawyers from the county seat, and the matter was going to take months to resolve. But the filing was public, which meant the county seat newspaper had run a brief item, which meant the people who dealt with Silas Crow commercially now knew what he'd done. 3 of his warehouse accounts have gone to other suppliers, Harlan said, with the tone of someone reporting weather. Beaumont's operation, which he's been supplying for 6 years, gave notice last week. Etta remembered Beaumont at her common room table, saying he'd rather stop here than add 2 days to his drive. She looked at Harlan and kept her face neutral. "And Ed Phelps," Harlan said, "is buying his dry goods from the Carver's Bend Merchants Cooperative now. He told me yesterday he'd been meaning to make the change for a while." "People make their decisions," Etta said. Harlan looked at her. He was a careful man who chose his words slowly, and when he said the next thing, she could tell he'd been carrying it for a while. "I should have pushed back more," he said. "When he came in that morning and wanted the debt called in, I should have found a reason to stall." She looked at him. "You wrote the receipt when it was settled," she said. "You wrote it fair." "That's not the same as what I should have done." "No," she said. "But it's not nothing either." He nodded, slowly, and put his hat back on. He looked at the lodge, the sign, the solid walls, the smoke coming from both chimneys. "Martin would have been proud," he said, and then looked slightly alarmed as if he hadn't intended to say it. She waited a moment before answering. "Yes," she said. "I think he would have." Harlan rode back to town, and she stood in the yard for a minute in the February cold, her breath making shapes in the air that the wind immediately dissolved. She thought about Martin, which she let herself do rarely, not because it hurt, but because it tended to take her somewhere that wasn't useful, and she had too much to do to spend long in places that weren't useful. She thought about him buying the 60 acres because he'd seen something in land that other people had given up on. And she thought about how right he'd been and how wrong the timing had been, and how those 2 things had existed together in a way she'd spent 2 years learning to hold without breaking. She went back inside. The fire in the common room needed another log. The kitchen inventory needed updating. Marta, the cook from Carver's Bend, was coming Thursday, and the kitchen needed to be at its best. She put the log on the fire and opened the notebook and got to work, because the lodge was full, and the season was not finished, and there were things to do that would not wait for February sentiment. What she didn't see, because she was inside and the cold was outside, and some things arranged themselves without witnesses, was Thorne standing at the stable door 60 feet away, watching the yard where she'd just been standing, and then going back to work with the specific expression of a man who has made a decision he isn't ready to say out loud yet. The spring would come, the pass would open wider, more traffic, more need, more building. That was all ahead of them, visible in outline if not in detail. What had already happened was enough for now. What they'd built was standing in the February cold and showing no signs of going anywhere, and that, Etta thought, when she thought about it at all, was the beginning of something she hadn't let herself name yet. Spring came to the Callaway Range the way it always did, not as an arrival, but as a slow argument between seasons, the cold refusing to concede ground without a fight. March brought thaw days that softened the upper trails enough to let the earliest travelers through the pass, and with them came the first wave of traffic that told Etta her calculations about the spring season had been, if anything, conservative. By the second week of March, Summit Crossing Lodge had housed more guests in 14 days than it had in the entire first month of operation. The sleeping rooms ran at capacity most nights. Marta had been in the kitchen since late February and had reorganized the food storage with an efficiency that made Etta feel the particular pleasure of watching someone else do something exactly right. The new stable hand, a young man named Cord, who Thorne had found through the Halloran brothers, knew horses the way some people know languages, instinctively, without having to translate. The lodge had become, in the 4 months since they'd driven the first survey stake, something that functioned. Not perfectly. There were still arguments about supply timing, still days when too many things needed doing at once, and the margin between manageable and chaos was thinner than anyone wanted. But it functioned, and functioning was not a small thing when you understood what it had taken to get there. What Etta hadn't fully anticipated was what it would feel like to watch other people use what she'd built. She stood in the common room doorway one morning in mid-March and watched a family she didn't know eat breakfast at the long table. A man and a woman and 3 children of descending ages, the smallest one barely old enough to hold a spoon properly, all of them warm and fed in a room that 4 months ago had been a 60-acre field that nobody wanted. The mother cut the small child's food without looking up from her own plate, the automatic competence of a woman who has done this 10,000 times, and the child ate, and outside the window the Callaway Range showed the first patches of bare rock where the snowpack was retreating. Etta stood there longer than she'd intended, and then went back to the accounts, because the accounts were where the next problem always was. The legal situation with Silas Crow resolved in April, the way legal situations involving men with money and lawyers tend to resolve. Not cleanly, not satisfyingly, but definitively enough that it was over. He paid a substantial fine for the falsified county document, which Fenn had testified to in full detail with the thoroughness of a man trying to reduce his own consequences. The arson conspiracy charge against Crow was harder to make stick directly. Greer had been the intermediary, and Greer took a plea and served 60 days, and Crow's lawyers successfully argued that no direct communication between Crow and the men on the property could be proven. Deering served 4 months. Sheriff Alcott rode out to Summit Crossing in April to deliver the news personally. He sat at the common room table and laid it out plainly, and Etta listened and didn't show what she felt, because what she felt was complicated in a way she hadn't expected. "He walks," she said. "On the arson charge, yes," Alcott said. "The fine stands. The county document case is on record with his name attached. That doesn't go away." "But he doesn't go to jail." "No." Alcott paused. "I want to be straight with you. I pushed as hard as the evidence allowed. The Greer buffer was deliberate. Crow is careful about distance." She looked at him. She believed he was telling the truth. "Thank you," she said, "for taking it seriously." "I took it seriously because you documented it seriously," he said. "The letter you sent in November, the timeline, the papers, the inspector's handwritten threat. If you hadn't had all that, we'd have had the word of a 20-year-old hired man against Silas Crow's lawyers." She nodded. She'd known that in September, before she even knew what she was documenting it against. Alcott put his hat on and stood up. He looked around the common room, the fire, the tables, the occupied sleeping room hallway where 2 voices were having a quiet conversation. "You've built something here," he said. "We built something," she said. He nodded. "Yes." He paused at the door. Crow's going to be quieter from here. The fine hit him, and the commercial damage hit him more. 3 major accounts walking away in February that's the kind of thing that changes the shape of a business. He looked at her. I don't think he'll come at you again. I don't think so either, she said, but I'll keep documenting. He almost smiled. That's the right answer. And then he rode south, back toward Millhaven and the county seat, and the ordinary machinery of law that moved slowly and produced imperfect outcomes and was, for all that, better than the alternative. Thorne was at the stable when Alcott left. He came in 20 minutes later and found Etta at the table where she always was, and he read the outcome on her face before she said a word. Fine and a record, he said. Yes. He sat down across from her. He didn't say that it was enough, or that she should feel satisfied, or any of the things people say to manage other people's disappointment. He just sat with it for a moment, which she appreciated more than words. How do you feel? He said. It was a question he didn't ask often. She thought about it seriously. Like I wanted the ending to be cleaner than it was, she said. And like I knew it wouldn't be, and I built toward what was possible instead of what I wanted. She paused. Which is probably the right way to do it, but it doesn't feel triumphant. No, he said. It doesn't. He hurt people before us, she said. He'll be more careful now, but careful isn't the same as stopped. Thorne was quiet for a moment. You can't fix everything that was broken before you got here, he said. You can fix the part in front of you. She looked at him. It was not the kind of thing he usually said. He was not, generally, a man who reached for the philosophical. It came out like something he'd been sitting with for a while. Is that what you tell yourself? She said. When it helps, he said. Which is not always. She nodded. She went back to the accounts, and he went back to the stable, and the lodge around them continued to do what it did, hold people who needed holding, for as long as they needed it, at a fair price, without asking them to be anything other than what they were. The incident that changed things between them happened on a Tuesday in late April, which was, as far as either of them was concerned, an ordinary Tuesday. Thorne was replacing a section of fence on the north perimeter. The winter had done damage that needed dressing before the spring cattle drive started coming through, and the fence needed to actually do something. He'd been at it since early morning, and by afternoon he'd been at it long enough that the particular kind of focus that comes from physical repetitive work had taken over, the kind where you stop thinking about everything except the thing in front of you. Etta came out at mid-afternoon with coffee, and without announcement, the way she'd started doing on days when she noticed he hadn't come in. She set the cup on a fence post and started handing him boards from the stack without being asked, which she'd also started doing without making a thing of it. They worked in silence for a while. That was something that had developed between them over the winter, a comfort with shared silence that neither of them had commented on, because commenting on it would have changed its quality. After a while, Thorne said, without looking up from the nail he was setting, Clara told me something this morning. She handed him another board. What did she tell you? She told me she wants to study business, that she's been reading your accounts, and she wants to understand how the numbers work. He paused. She asked me if I thought she was smart enough. Etta looked at him. What did you tell her? I told her she was already doing it, he said. She just needed to know that what she was doing had a name. Etta was quiet for a moment. She thought about her daughter sitting at the table in the evenings with the notebook open, asking questions that Etta answered because the questions were good. She thought about the 12-year-old who had slept in room 1 with a whistle on a cord and hadn't flinched. Thank you, she said. She's going to be better at this than either of us, he said. I know, Etta said. He drove the nail and reached for the next board. Their hands made contact in the handoff. Brief, unintentional, the normal friction of two people working in close quarters. He stopped. She noticed that he stopped. There was a moment that was different from the other moments. She could feel it in the quality of the silence, which had changed its texture. Etta, he said. She waited. He set down the hammer, which was a thing he didn't do in the middle of a task. He looked at her with the directness he used for things he'd decided to say, whether or not saying them was comfortable. I'm not sure what I'm doing, he said. With this, He stopped. I'm not a man who does this well. Saying things like this. I know, she said. I want to say it anyway, he said, because I've been not saying it for 4 months, and I think that's its own kind of dishonesty. She looked at him. She'd known this was coming in the way you know something is coming when you've been aware of it from the corner of your eye for a long time and simply haven't turned to look at it directly. She'd been not turning on purpose, because turning meant having a conversation she wasn't sure she was ready to have, and not being ready was a condition she was generally intolerant of in herself. I'm 41 years old, she said. I have 2 children and 60 acres and a business I'm still learning to run, and a man I buried 2 years ago. She paused. I don't know what I want. That's honest, he said. It's the best I can do right now. He nodded slowly. He picked up the hammer again. All right, he said. Is that enough? She said. It's what you have, he said. That makes it enough. They went back to work. The fence got finished. Neither of them said anything else about it that day, but something had changed in the way that things change when they've been said out loud. They can't be unsaid, can't be moved back to the position of unacknowledged, and the air around them carries the weight of the said thing even in silence. That evening, Clara found her mother at the common room table and sat down and looked at her with the specific expression of a 12-year-old who has observed something and is deciding whether to say it. What? Etta said. Nothing, Clara said. Clara. I just think, Clara said carefully, that Mr. Mercer is a good man. Etta looked at her daughter. He is, she said, and you're… Clara stopped. I'm what? You're less tired than you were in October, Clara said finally. You look less like you're carrying something by yourself. Etta sat with that for a moment. It was, she thought, a 12-year-old's version of something true. Go to bed, she said. You have work in the morning. Clara went, but she went with the satisfied expression of someone who has said what they came to say. May brought the first cattle drives. Beaumont's operation came through first, as agreed, 23 animals and 6 men, and Aurelio the cook, who came into Marta's kitchen and spent 20 minutes in the same ritual of professional examination he'd done the previous December, and this time nodded at the modifications Marta had made and said, Better. Marta said, I know, without looking up from the pot she was stirring. Beaumont himself sat at the common room table after supper and went over the arrangement for the fall drive with Etta, and the conversation was a different kind of conversation than the one they'd had in December. It was a business conversation between 2 people who knew each other well enough to skip the cautious language. They agreed on rates for the season. They agreed on the blacksmith situation, which Etta had resolved in March by contracting a smith named Orville from Frost Hollow to work 2 days a week at the lodge during drive season, with a permanent position coming when the spring expansion was complete. 2 more cattle operations came through in May. A sheep rancher from the High Valley named Prescott, who was taciturn to the point of poetry, but who paid exactly what he owed and left the rooms in better condition than he found them. A merchant's caravan of 4 wagons that stayed 3 nights because one of the axles needed replacement, and Orville, who happened to be on site, turned out to know enough about wagon axle repair to handle it. By the time June arrived, Summit Crossing Lodge was not a lodging station anymore. It was the center of something. This was a thing Etta noticed gradually, and then all at once, the way you don't see a plant growing, and then one day you look at it and it's large. The Cord family had moved into a small cabin on the south end of the property because Cord, the stable hand, had a wife and a new baby and needed somewhere to be that wasn't bunkhouse. Walt had taken on 2 apprentices and was teaching them stonework, using the spring expansion as the classroom. Marta had hired a kitchen helper, a girl of 15 named Dora, who was learning to cook with the focused intensity of someone who has decided this is what they're going to do with their life. Orville the blacksmith had stopped going back to Frost Hollow on the days he wasn't contracted because there was enough work here to fill the days in between. People were living here. That was the thing, not just passing through, living. Robbie, who was 9 now and had grown 2 inches since September, had developed a full working relationship with Cord and spent most of his non-school hours in the stable learning things that Etta had opinions about and mostly kept to herself. He'd also, she noticed, started doing what Clara did, observing, recording, carrying small pieces of the operation in his head the way children carry things that matter to them. He told her one evening at supper that Cord's roan was going to need a shoe reset before the next drive season because he'd been watching the way it walked. She looked at him. When did you notice that? Last week, he said. I told Mr. Mercer, and he said he'd have Orville look at it. She looked at Thorne, who was eating at the other end of the table. He shrugged. He was right about the shoe, he said. She went back to her supper. Her son had told Thorne Mercer about a horse's shoe, and Thorne had taken it seriously, and this was the shape of how things had become. Silas Crow came to Summit Crossing Lodge on a Thursday in June. He came alone, which was either courage or humility or some combination of the two things that looked the same from the outside. He rode up the south road in the late morning and tied his horse at the post Cord had built and came to the main door and stood on the porch for a moment before he knocked. Etta answered it herself, because she was in the common room doing accounts and heard the knock and went. She opened the door and looked at him. He was a man who had, since February, been reduced by legal trouble and commercial damage, and the specific erosion that comes from having your reputation take a hit in a small community. He didn't look broken. Silas Crow was not the kind of man who broke, but he looked smaller than she remembered him, like a thing that had been inflated by certainty and had lost some of the air. They looked at each other for a moment. "Mrs. Rowan," he said. "Mr. Crow," she said. "I'm coming through to the county seat," he said. "I need a meal and a night's lodging." She looked at him for a moment longer than necessary. Not to make him wait, she'd already decided, but because she wanted to see what was in his face, and what was in his face was a complicated thing that she couldn't fully read and wasn't sure she needed to. "Common room's open," she said. "Supper's at 6. The rate is the same as anyone else." He nodded once. "Fair enough," he said. She moved aside and he came in. She told Thorne about it that afternoon, when she found him at the fence again. There was always something wrong with the fence, which she had come to think of as the property's way of giving Thorne somewhere to put his hands when he needed to think. He listened. His jaw did the thing it did when he was working out how he felt about something. "You're sure?" he said. "He's a paying guest," she said. "He gets what every paying guest gets." "That's more generous than I'd be," Thorne said. "I know," she said. "That's why I'm the one who runs the rooms." He almost smiled. He went back to the fence. Crow ate supper in the common room with 8 other guests and said nothing that drew attention. He ate what was on the table, paid the 50 cents for the meal, and went to his room. He was not charming, and he was not abject, and he was not any of the things she might have scripted for him if she'd been writing the story of this moment rather than living it. He was just a man at a table eating food he hadn't cooked in a building he'd tried to burn down and failed. At breakfast the next morning he came to find her before he left. She was in the kitchen, going over the week's supply list with Marta. He waited in the kitchen doorway until she looked up. "I'm settling the account," he said. "I'll get the ledger," she said. She wrote the total, he paid it, and she gave him the receipt. She wrote it the same way Harlan had written the receipt 8 months ago. The amount, the date, the transaction, all of it plain and factual and complete. He took it and folded it and put it in his coat. He started to turn. "Mr. Crow?" she said. He looked back. She wasn't sure, until she said it, what she was going to say. She'd had months to think about what she would say to this man if she ever stood across from him with the ledger between them and the building intact around her. She'd thought about sharp things, true things, things that would land precisely where she aimed them. What came out was simpler than any of that. "I hope the county seat goes well for you," she said. He looked at her for a moment. Something passed across his face that she couldn't name. Not guilt exactly, something less clean than guilt. The expression of a man who has been given something he didn't earn and knows it. "Yes," he said. "Thank you." He left. Marta, who had been very still during the entire exchange, said, "I would not have been that calm." "I know," Etta said. She picked up the supply list. "What are we short on?" The summer was the shape of what their future was going to be, and they could both see it. Etta saw it in the accounts. The numbers that no longer caused the tight feeling in her chest when she checked them. The numbers that now produced something closer to the satisfaction of a thing working the way it was designed to. The construction debt was cleared in July, 2 months ahead of her most optimistic schedule. She sat with the final payment receipt for a long time the evening she wrote it, not because she was being sentimental, but because she wanted to remember what it felt like to close that chapter, to hold the specific weight of something finished. Thorne saw it in the property. He walked it in the early mornings the way he'd walked the mountains, systematically, knowing every foot of it, alert to what had changed and what needed attention. He watched the Cord family's cabin put out lamplight in the evenings and the kitchen's pre-dawn smoke start-up before the sun cleared the Callaway Range and the stable fill with animals that needed care. And he thought about the thing he'd said to Etta that November in the half-framed common room. We might actually pull this off. What they'd pulled off was larger than what he'd imagined when he said it, which was not something he was used to feeling about his own plans. He told her this one evening in August, when they were sitting on the porch of the main lodge after the supper guests had settled and the property had gone to its night sounds. It was the kind of evening that happens in mountain country in late summer. The air cool enough to want a coat, but not cold enough to need one. The sky doing something spectacular to the west that neither of them was mentioning because pointing at beautiful things felt unnecessary. I underestimated it, he said. She looked at him. The lodge? What it would become, he paused. What you would build. She was quiet for a moment. We built it, she said. I know, he said, but you, the shape of it, that's you. I provided the timber and the stonework and the muscle. The shape of what it became is yours. She thought about arguing with that and decided he was partly right. The shape of it was hers. She'd carried that shape in her head since the first evening she and Thorne had looked at the survey notes together. And she'd built toward it through 4 months of weather and sabotage and budget strain and county inspectors and a blizzard and everything else the winter had sent. The shape had held. I couldn't have done it without the partnership, she said. That's not modesty. That's accounting. I know, he said. They sat with that for a while. Then he said, I want to ask you something. She recognized the particular quality of it, the same quality the Tuesday at the fence had, the thing being said instead of not said. She waited. I've been thinking about the spring expansion, he said. The second phase. What comes after the bathing room and the blacksmith shop. She'd been thinking about it too. In fact, she had 6 pages in the notebook. What about it? I want to build a house, he said. On the north end of the property. Not big, something permanent. He paused. I want to know if that's something you'd want for the partnership. She looked at him. The west sky was finishing its business and going dark, and the first stars were deciding whether to commit. You're asking if the partnership is permanent, she said. Yes, he said. You could have said that. I did say it, he said, in a roundabout way. Thorne. Yes. I don't know if I'll ever be easy about it, she said. I had a husband I loved and lost him, and that doesn't go away. I'm not the same person I was before that. She paused. And I'm not easy about myself in general, about who I am and how I look and what people think. I've gotten better at not letting it run me, but it's still there. I know, he said. You say that a lot. Because it's usually true, he said. She looked out at the property, the lights in Cord's cabin, the glow from the kitchen where Marta was finishing the last of the day's work, the dark shape of the stable where 12 animals were settled for the night, the main lodge behind them, warm and solid, holding people inside it who were sleeping or talking or looking at their own ceiling, thinking about where they were going next. Build the house, she said. He was quiet for a moment. That's a yes? That's a yes to the house, she said. The rest of it we figure out as we go. That's fair, he said. It's the best I have, she said. Same as February. Same as February, he agreed, and she could hear in it that he'd held on to that moment the same way she had, and that it had meant something to him when she said it was enough. The north end of the property had good ground. She'd known that since the first survey. Walt started on the foundation in September, with his 2 apprentices doing most of the labor while he directed with the authority of a man who has earned the right to stand back and point. Thorne worked on it in the evenings and the early mornings, before the lodge's day started, and Etta noticed that he was more particular about this building than he'd been about any part of the lodge, not more careful, because he was always careful, but more considered. He thought about each decision longer. She didn't comment on this. She watched it from the middle distance and filed it in the part of her that was still learning what kind of man he was. Clara turned 13 in October. Etta had been planning the birthday quietly, a cake from Marta, a new notebook of her own because Clara had started keeping her own accounts from things she'd observed, and a small occasion in the common room after the supper guests settled. What she hadn't planned was that Thorne would appear at supper with a set of accounting ledgers he'd ordered from the county seat bookseller. Proper ledgers, the kind businesses used, hardbound with ruled columns. He set them in front of Clara without ceremony and said, "You've been doing real work. You should have real tools." Clara looked at the ledgers, and then at Thorne, and then at her mother, and then back at the ledgers. For a moment she looked exactly as young as she was, which she didn't always. She'd been carrying herself older than 13 for a year. "Thank you," she said. "Use them," he said, and went back to his supper. Robbie looked at the ledgers, and then at Thorne, and then at Etta. "I want ledgers too," he said. "When you can add a column of figures without using your fingers," Etta said. He considered this. "How many fingers is too many?" "All of them," she said. He went back to his supper to work this out. Etta looked at Thorne across the table. He caught her eye. Nothing passed between them that would have been visible to anyone watching, but something passed between them that was specific and real. The kind of communication that develops between people who have been through enough together that they don't need words for all of it. The year turned. The second winter at Summit Crossing Lodge was different from the first, the way all second things are different. You know what's coming, you've built toward it, and the thing that surprised you last time is the thing you prepared for this time. The blizzard still came. The pass still closed for stretches. The supply routes still required managing. But the lodge rode it with the steadiness of a thing that had been tested and had held. And that steadiness had a quality to it that first-time guests felt when they walked in from the cold. The sense that this was a real place, built by people who intended for it to last. Frost Hollow had been quiet about Summit Crossing Lodge for most of the fall, which was its own form of acknowledgement. The businesses in town that had lost traffic to the lodge had adjusted, some of them by finding other markets, some of them by accepting that the two operations served different needs, and the rivalry was less zero-sum than it had seemed. Ed Phelps at the feed store had begun buying from Carver's Bend and Crow's reduced operation and through Summit Crossing's supply arrangements, which was a man finding a way to be practical about a changed landscape. The one conversation Etta hadn't expected came from Margaret Delaney. Margaret came out to the lodge in November, not on a supply errand, just came. She arrived on a Wednesday afternoon when the common room was quiet and asked for a cup of coffee and sat at the table and was clearly there to say something. Etta poured the coffee and sat across from her. "I want to ask you something," Margaret said. "All right." "How do you keep it from making you bitter?" she said. "All of it. What Crow did. What the town said. All of it." Etta looked at her for a moment. It was a genuine question. She could see that. Margaret Delaney was 60 years old and had run a boarding house for 20 of those years and had opinions about nearly everything and had never, in all that time, asked Etta Rowan for advice. "I don't keep it from making me bitter," Etta said. "I get bitter. I just don't let the bitter do the deciding." Margaret sat with that. "There's a difference?" "There's a big difference," Etta said. "Bitter tells you how you feel. It doesn't have to tell you what you do." Margaret wrapped both hands around the coffee cup. "I said things. When you started building, I was one of the loudest." "I know," Etta said. "I was wrong," Margaret said. The words came out straight and plain, which cost her something. Etta could see that. "Yes," Etta said. "You were." She didn't add anything to it. She didn't say it was all right, because that would have been dishonest. And she didn't say she forgave it, because the forgiving was an ongoing thing rather than a moment. And she didn't say anything that would let Margaret off the hook before she'd finished sitting with what she'd said. But she also didn't extend it, because there was no value in that either. After a while, Margaret said, "Your daughter, Clara, what are you going to do about her schooling?" "She's at the schoolhouse in Frost Hollow 3 days a week," Etta said. "I mean beyond that," Margaret said. "She's not an ordinary student. The teacher told me I was on the school board last year, and she mentioned the girl in a conversation about students who exceeded the curriculum." She paused. "There's a school in Aldermore for girls who are going to do something serious with themselves." Etta looked at her. "I know about the Aldermore school. Can you manage the cost?" "Not yet," Etta said. "By the time she's of age, yes." Margaret nodded. She drank her coffee. She set the cup down. "If there's a shortfall," she said carefully, "I have some money put aside that isn't doing anything." The silence that followed that was a particular kind of silence. "Why?" Etta said. "Because I was wrong, and I can't undo it," Margaret said. "And I'm too old to spend the rest of my life knowing I did nothing about it." Etta looked at her for a long moment. She thought about all the ways a person could respond to that, and she set most of them aside. "I'll remember the offer," she said, "if we need it." Margaret nodded, finished her coffee, and left. And Etta sat in the common room for a while after she left and thought about the way things moved in communities, how contempt and damage and wrong-headedness left marks that were real and lasting, and how sometimes, slowly, the people who made those marks found ways to do something with the knowledge of what they'd done. Not always. Not everyone. But sometimes. It wasn't closure. It wasn't the clean ending she might have wanted if she'd been writing toward one. But it was real, which was better. The North House was finished in December, just before the heavy snow closed the pass again. It was a small house, 2 rooms and a kitchen and a sleeping loft, built from the same granite Walt had worked with on the lodge, with a fireplace in the main room that drew perfectly, and a window on the east side that looked out at the pass and caught the morning light. Thorne moved into it on the 2nd week of December. On the first evening, he had a fire going in the new fireplace. Etta brought supper from the lodge kitchen. A practical thing, she said, since Marta had made too much and it was a waste to let it sit. He accepted this at face value, or chose to, and they ate in the new house at a small table he'd built himself, and the fire did its job. And through the east window, the snow on the Callaway Range caught the last of the evening light and went the color of something almost warm. After supper, she looked around the room. It was spare and clean and exactly what he was. Nothing extra, nothing performed, everything chosen for a reason. "It's good," she said. "It'll do," he said. She stood up and put on her coat. She looked at him sitting at the table in his own house, in the firelight, and she thought about the man who had ridden into Frost Hollow 14 months ago with a pouch of coins and laid them out on Harlan Briggs's counter one at a time. She thought about what it meant that he'd done that, and what it had set in motion, and where they were now relative to where they'd been. "Thorne," she said. He looked up. "I'm glad you came back from the mountains," she said. He was quiet for a moment. "So am I," he said. She went out into the cold and across the property to the lodge, where the fire was going and Marta was finishing the kitchen, and Clara was at the common room table with her new ledgers, working a column of figures in the lamplight with the focused expression of someone who has found the thing they're going to be good at for the rest of their life. Robbie was asleep. Cord's cabin had its light on. The stable was quiet. She stood in the common room doorway and looked at it all. The room, the fire, her daughter with her ledgers, the property outside the window where a small house was lit from inside by a fire that was going to keep going all winter. This was what she'd built. Not the building. The building was stone and timber and the labor of months. The thing she'd built was this, a place where people who needed shelter found it, where work made sense, where the future had a shape you could see clearly enough to move toward. She'd started with 60 acres that nobody wanted, and a debt she couldn't pay, and the particular exhausted stubbornness of a woman who didn't know how to stop when stopping would have been the easier thing. She didn't know, standing there, if that counted as wisdom or just as the absence of alternatives. Maybe they were the same thing sometimes. Maybe the people who built lasting things weren't always the ones with the most vision or the most resources or the smoothest path. Maybe they were just the ones who kept moving when the stopping looked easier. She thought about the town that had laughed. She thought about the laughter, the way it felt, the specific quality of being the thing other people found funny without meaning to be. She'd expected that resolving into triumph, into the satisfying reversal where the laughers fell silent and the laughed at stood vindicated on high ground. What had actually happened was different. The laughter had just become irrelevant. Not punished, not reversed, irrelevant. The lodge was real and the laughter was old noise, and real things outlast old noise every time. That was the truth of it, and it wasn't a comfortable truth because it meant you couldn't live for the reversal. You had to live for the building. You had to put your attention on what you were making rather than on what the people who doubted you were doing with their faces. She went to the table and sat down next to Clara. "What column?" she said. "Supply costs versus revenue, October through December," Clara said. "I want to see where the margin is thinnest." "November," Etta said. "Always November. The guest volume isn't at full winter pace yet, but the heating costs are already up." Clara made a note. "How do you account for it?" "You build the October surplus to cover it," she said. "You know it's coming, so you plan around it." Clara wrote that down in the ledger. Then she looked at her mother. Are you happy? Etta looked at her daughter. She thought about the question seriously, the way she thought about all serious questions. Yes, she said. Not in the way I expected to be, but yes. Clara nodded like that was the truest thing anyone had said to her in a while. Then she went back to the column of figures, and Etta opened her own notebook, and in the warm common room of Summit Crossing Lodge, the two of them worked in the lamplight, with the fire going and the snow falling outside and everything they'd built standing solid around them in the dark.